Sega previews Saturn at CES. Commodore warns of bankruptcy. And Doom brings corporate networks to their knees. These stories and many more on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, the show where we travel back in time to find out what was making headlines in the home computer and video game industries of yesteryear. I'm your host, Carl, and I'm joined again by everybody's favorite co-host, Alex.
Happy to be here, Carl.
Excellent. So, before we can turn on the time machine and head back 30 years to March of 1994, it's time for obligatory podcast banter. So, what have you been up to?
I don't know. Not much. Just kind of living life. We're under 100 days to Dragon Con now, though, so that's exciting.
Oh, that's true. September is on the doorstep. And speaking of Dragon Con, I finally got around to, I found the time, better said, to watch the video version of your Dragon Con presentation from last year about the seventh guest. And I must say, an extremely fun time. It took me right back to being in one of the panels at Dragon Con. It was awesome.
Very nice. Yes. No, we tried to have a little fun with it. We brought props. Which was entirely Jeffrey's idea.
And when Jeffrey pulled up the piece of paper, the blue piece of paper, and then he punched the hole in it, and then he pulls out the... Oh, no. Everybody, you need to go watch this. If you're not already a patron of They Create Worlds, Alex's other podcast. I don't know why he has another one. There's really no point. He's here. But... Yeah, you do realize you generate far more hours of content on this show than on your show, right?
That is true, but you know, the nice thing about this one is I just have to show up. You do all the research. I just provide pithy commentary, unlike on my podcast where I have to do all the research about the things that happen when I open my mouth.
This is true. But yes, that was really, that was a nice bonus. I mean, well done. My hat's
thank
off.
you very much. We are, of course, going to be back at Dragon Con again this year. We haven't decided what the props will be yet, but we're definitely going to bring props again. And this time we will be doing a presentation on Dungeons and Dragons and video games. Basically, how and why D&D adaptations on computer platforms started springing up so quickly after the publication of Dungeons and Dragons, and then a little bit about how over time all game genres absorbed more and more RPG mechanics until just about every game out there today has at least something that it's derived from RPGs. As people who follow the Time Machine and our jumps know, this year is the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons, so a lot of cons are doing a lot of focus on that, and it made sense for us to do the same.
Makes perfect sense. In a curious side note, I just got invited to give I don't want to call it a keynote speech, but I've been invited to give a speech about the history of D&D at a large RPG conference this November. So that should
very
be
nice.
fun. Yeah. Apparently... Gary Gygax's son, I believe, Luke, is his name, is going to be there as well. So, it should be fun. And so, yes, that's become my additional side project of preparing the research for that one. And I will be cribbing many a note from your episode.
Indeed. And, don't forget to crib many a note from John Peterson as well, because nobody knows the Dungeons and Dragons history like he does.
Yes, I was definitely going to reference that book. That's the next one I have to attack as soon as time permits.
And believe me, attack is an apt analogy for that book, which makes They Create Worlds Volume 1 look like a breezy beach read.
Oh, that's very demotivating. Thank you very much.
No, it's a fantastic book, though.
No, yeah, I know
he's actually revising. The original's out of print now, and he's actually split it into 2 volumes. And the first volume is launching pretty soon now. I mean, it's sometime this year. I just forget the exact month. I'm not sure when the second volume's coming. So he is doing some reorganization. I mean, it's fantastic, but it is massive and it is meticulous.
Excellent. So I will be attacking that here. Going to start it before the semester is out, but as soon as the semester is out in July, then I've got some serious hours to invest in it, and I will be doing that so that I can give an accurate and somewhat entertaining take on it. I've got 2 options right now for two approaches to the presentation, and haven't decided which one to do yet, but that'll hopefully be worked out in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, but sounds like a good time, though. I wish you luck with that.
Thank you. I will see if I can get it filmed. I haven't decided yet if I'm doing it in German or English, though. That's the big question. I have not decided. I have to talk to the organizers to see which option will be acceptable, or if both options are acceptable. Probably be easier just to do it in German, but we will see. Now, on another note, speaking of big events, we have our joint monthly live stream coming up Friday the 31st.
Yes,
have we
indeed.
decided on a time yet? Because I believe we wanted to do 6 p.m. Eastern Standard
Yes,
Time.
that is the time that we agreed on, and unless you're
Excellent.
altering the deal.
No, I'm not
the time
altering
we agreed
the deal.
on.
No. 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That would be midnight German time, 11 p.m. English time, and you guys can figure out, depending on where you are in the world, what time that is for you. And we will be opening up the voting for which games you'd like to see us play during the live stream. Probably around the same time that this episode goes live, so about a week or so before that date. You don't have to be a patron to vote. You do have to be a patron to take part in the live stream. So, hey, chuck in that buck every month to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, or become a patron of They Create Worlds, or why not do both? Come on, it's the season for giving, and we're recording this in May. So,
yes,
whatever floats your boat.
It's a good time. We play games and answer some of the very deep questions. I believe in the last hangout we settled which game companies corresponded to which great powers in 19th century Europe. Very important burning question that everyone needs to be thinking about in the back of their mind due to its relevance today.
Exactly. And we had also friends of the show. Ethan was there. Our good friend Quarter Past was there. There was a lot of fun discussion had, and I do look forward to the next one. So,
absolutely.
With that being said, the other wonderful perk of being a patron. Have I mentioned being a patron enough yet? Yes, No. I'll mention it again. So, of this show is that you get the video version of our first segment, the 7 Minutes in Heaven, where our intrepid co-host must play a game that was reviewed in a publication dated March of 1994 that they've never played before. And remember, everybody, for all purposes, when we're talking about March of 1984, we're always using cover dates of magazines and newspapers because it's a framing device. And yes, the news may or may not have happened at some point before that. But, so I have to always put the warning in. I've learned my lesson. I left it out twice, and I got emails. So, and yes, if you want to send me an email, comments, questions, whatever, we got some great news stuff from friend of the show, SM Oliva, sent in some news, and also from our good friend Lawrence. We've been going back and forth, even more discussion from our 40-year jumps about the various versions of the x86 architecture. Very, very interesting. We're probably going to have to do an extra episode. Yes, I've asked Lawrence if he'll do an extra episode. He hasn't written back to me yet. But, hey, I'm putting it out there, so now there's pressure. So, we had a lot of great games. We had Microcosm on the Amiga CD32, Mario's Time Machine on DOS. What else do we have here? Sam and Max, Leisure Suit Larry 6. We had Little Devil, Alone in the Dark 2, Strike Commander Enhanced CD version, which, why not? And of course, Mortal Kombat 2 in the arcades, Total Eclipse on the 3DO. But and I can't believe you passed on this: Terminator 2 Judgment Day Chess Wars. How could you have not wanted to play that? But
it's fair call out, Carl. Fair call out.
Yeah, but you put all those aside and you chose
Mega Turrican.
Oh yes. So we're going to get ourselves some jumping and shooting action going on. So, are you ready, Alex?
Let's go take it to that machine army, Carl.
Welcome back, Alex, from your 7 minutes in heaven. So, for the uninitiated, how would you describe Mega Turrican based on your 7 minutes with the game?
Well, Carl, Mega Turrican is like Contra 3 if you couldn't shoot diagonally and half the power-ups sucked.
Okay, now, with that glowing review out of the way, that's actually a very, very apt description of this game. Was this your first Turrican experience?
It was. I certainly know that the originals on the C64 by Manfred Trenz are national treasures of Germany, and I've heard they're very, very good. I mean, I would never disparage those sight unseen, but of course, this game was not done by him. It was done by other developers without his input, and the apple is starting to fall a little far from the tree.
Yes. I mean, you do have the amazing music by Chris Hülsbeck, which was missing from the C64 versions. That is true. The music on those is completely different. But yes.
The music was fantastic, and you can tell the good people at Factor 5 are good programmers because it is technically competent. I mean, there are design problems, but the technical implementation seems pretty top-notch.
Yeah. No, I mean, technically, these guys know what they're doing, especially with the 68,000 processor at this point. But yeah, there's no real good design there.
No.
Now, the traditional Turrican laser whip was traded out for a laser lasso hangamabob, thingamabob. How did you come to grips with that?
Slowly and not entirely successfully. I mean, obviously, as we always say in these, of course, I go in without reading any instructions, without watching any Let's Plays, and it's a game I've never played before. So it took me a bit. I mean, I got to some jumps that it was clear that I was stuck and I couldn't jump. So by messing around with buttons, I did finally figure out a way to extend this thing. I mean, I only had a little bit of time to fool around with it, but it didn't feel great. It was certainly no Super Metroid grapple beam, is what I would say about that. Okay.
Well, that is a very accurate portrayal of the situation. So would you recommend this game to anybody else?
No, I would not. I mean, the soundtrack's a banger, so I do have to give a shout-out to Crystal Speck for that. His soundtracks are almost always bangers. But if you want a 16-bit console Turrican, stick to Super Turrican. I have not played it, but I've heard from more than just you, Carl. I've heard it out in the world. That is a fantastic game, unlike this one. So, yeah, stick with Super Turrican if you really need. However, special shout-out to that opening cutscene and the clear depiction of emotions contrary to the text provided by the narrative. That's all I'm going to say there. Become a patron. Become a patron if you want to know more.
Watch our reactions to that intro cutscene. Quite entertaining. There's no better way to put that. I'm going to chalk it up to, well, there's no excuse for it. It's just what it is. Oh well. Okay. Then it's time for us to move on and check in with our good friend Ethan to find out what we got wrong in our February 1994 jump in a little segment we call The Department of Corrections.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from
the Department of Corrections.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring. To accept charges, press 1. You may start the conversation now.
Welcome back, Ethan. So, before we find out everything that we got wrong in February of 1984...
Carl.
Yes.
I keep telling you, you can't bring friends into the Department of Corrections.
Oh, he's not my friend. He's my emotional support animal, I guess.
I'm his attorney.
Oh, yeah, that's it. That's
I mean, you need representation.
Who lawyers the lawyers, Alex? Really?
That's right. You know, other lawyers, everyone's hands in everyone else's pocket. That's the legal profession. But
indeed.
Yeah, you got to have representation when you come before the department to make sure no rights are violated, that, there's no corporate shenanigans that are improperly interpreted.
Do you think we care about rights in here? Come on. Well, Alex, since you are here, in fact, everything that I wrote down for this episode involves you, so you might as well be here for this.
Yeah, see,
I'm off the hook.
So I guess actually maybe this time Carl is my lawyer.
Dude, no retainer, no lawyer.
Money down? No.
I was looking for that quote. I was looking for it. So the Alex comment for February 1994. Alex was talking about Rocco's Modern Life as the best Nicktoon, but I'm afraid, Alex, you are by default wrong because Avatar counts as a Nicktoon. I'm sorry.
I do not acknowledge Avatar as a Nicktoon. It is a tune by Nickelodeon. But that is different than being part of the
It was
Nicktoon
under their Nicktoon brand. So.
Was it? Was it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Rocco's Modern Life was the best Nicktoon until the Fire Nation attacked, okay?
There we go.
Fine.
We'll go with that. It is it's definitely worth watching. If you have not, you did not experience it during the Nicktoon glory days.
No, that's fair. I know that Avatar is fantastic. When I think of Nicktoons, I think of the '90s output, and of the Nicktoons when I was a kid, it is Rocco's Modern Life, and I will not be taking questions at this time. But I will give you your avatar. I will give you your airbender. Very good.
Is it wrong that the last time I watched Nickelodeon, the best show on there was You Can't Do That on Television?
Yeah, that's not bad. I mean, I was there during like the peak period. I saw it all, man. So, like, I think that there's lots of good Nicktoons.
Absolutely.
But this is a video game history podcast. So February 1994, we return to the radical time of the 90s.
Cowabunga, dude.
Are you ready?
Hit me.
Okay. Alex, there is no F sound in Pyrrhic.
That's true.
Because it is Pyrrhus of Epirus.
Yes, it is. I often do that. I mean, but yes, that's one of those things that, you say it wrong when you're younger and then it just sticks with you. But absolutely, it is Pyrrhic. So, you got me there.
He also says nuclear. So, there's that.
Nuclear.
just wait for it to come back around, folks. You'll hear it.
I am looking for the nuclear vessels in Alameda.
I'm glad you said it. It was on the tip of my tongue.
And lastly, yes, this is a very short Department of Corrections. Alex went off about how console add-ons are always a failure, but you do have to acknowledge that the Famicom Disk System, though maybe not a success in how Nintendo wanted it, was a success in terms of the amount of people it penetrated.
The amount of people
this is a
wait.
I'm sorry. I knew when it was coming out of my mouth that there was something wrong, but I had to just finish it.
I mean, this is the Department of Corrections, so I suppose, a little bit of that is to be expected, but family show.
It's 11:40 at night in my time zone. You have no excuse for that.
No, but yes, all kidding aside, absolutely. The FDS was no 64 disk drive. That is for certain. I will concede you that point. It's absolutes are dangerous. I should have said almost never, and then I would have been correct.
So that will be all for February 1994 in the Department of Corrections. You two lawyers linked, at the wrist by handcuffs can waddle on out of here, and we will see you next time for March 1984.
As always, Ethan, thank you for your service.
And goodbye.
Okay, sure, Ethan, fine, call me out. Yes, absolutely, the Famicom Disk System was successful in the sense that it moved many, many, many units and many, many games like Legend of Zelda, sold many, many units. So, yeah, sure, the Famicom Disk System was successful, that's true. It was hated, however, by the publishers because Nintendo had already squeezed their margins to the bone on cartridges, and then they were like, haha, just kidding, you thought those were low margins. Now wait till you see what you get on the Famicom Disk System. So, of course, that spurred the third parties to do their own research into bigger cartridge sizes. Capcom made the big breakthrough there, and then everyone went flocking back to cartridge. So, long term, it kind of ends up in the dustbin of history, but it's no 64 disk drive. I mean, clearly it's no 64 disk drive. I mean, it was actually successful at the time. So, yes, I can admit that, Ethan. That's fair.
Okay, well, we have it now, and I wasn't the whipping boy this time. Woohoo! So,
it's good to have a little variety.
That's true. That's true. I'm sure I'll be up again for something next, so it's all good. Well, in that case, then, I think it's time to finally turn on the time machine and head back 30 years to March of 1994.
$4 billion a year business.
1994.
Information superhighway.
Welcome back to March of 1994. Alex, what's our first story?
Coinop goes big!
The International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions show in Los Angeles saw the debut for the first time at this show a VR product for amusement parks and special location-based entertainment product, like flight simulators, several amazing bits of CR. Oh, sorry, that was supposed to be VR.
Yes.
So, several amazing bits of VR and motion-based simulators were on display with massive price tags of up to $1.8 million per unit.
Yes, indeed. The Japanese have been building up to this for quite some time in their home market. Wonder Egg and Joypolis are already things, but now beginning to try to bring these concepts overseas. And as it says, being at the Amusement Parks and Attraction Show, this is really the play to try to make a new kind of amusement park for the digital age that can have a smaller footprint, but far more expensive and sophisticated kind of VR and full motion experience kind of contraptions.
Oh, definitely. And some of the stuff that they're showing off, I mean, we're talking extremely complex flight simulators with motion controls in them and, you know, cabinets moving up off the ground and stuff, which, I mean, I guess it's interesting, but I think it also combines very much with the discussion we've been having over the last year about how cuts to military spending have been forcing a lot of these contractors into this. So there's a lot of former military contractors teaming up with amusement park ride makers and stuff to build these devices. And I just don't see how it would ever pay off given the price tag on this machinery and how much you're ever going to actually be able to charge for it.
Well, yeah, because, you know, it's not just the price tag on the machinery. I mean, when you talk about a traditional amusement park ride, those tend to be able to seat a pretty decent number of people all at one time. These rides don't. They tend to seat very small number of people, and so every single one of these, just like a traditional amusement park ride, needs attendance to monitor them. And so the amount of staff that you need to keep enough of these running to satisfy all of the customers that may be coming in and wanting to play them. Because, I mean, amusement parks have the same problem, but like I said, those rides seat so many people at once that they can make that scale a little bit. You really can't with these things.
Yeah, no, there's no way to do that. I mean, Namco's got Galaxian 3 going on with like 16 people or whatever it is playing the game at the same time on a giant screen. That kind of makes sense, but these dark rides, for better or worse terminology, where you're in this little cockpit where it's only one person can fly the plane at a time. If you're charging $1.8 million and let's say you get on this ride for 5 minutes, that's 5 minutes for one person. And there's just no way you can have a turnaround that's efficient enough or a line that is going to be short enough for people to want to put up with that.
Exactly. I mean, I can remember... I remember the full motion simulators like this too, but I especially remember when VR was coming around to some of the amusement parks and whatnot, and it's just the lines were huge, the prices were exorbitant for minuscule amounts of playing time, and even being someone who enjoys video games and whatnot, I never wanted to deal with that. It just never seemed worth it.
Exactly. I mean, if you could do a massively multiplayer thing where you could either switch people out mid-game or, you know, get 16 people on the device all at once, but then the per unit cost needs to also be small enough that you can pull it off. And the rides also need to have enough thrill, and you have to compensate for the fact that it's a game. People have to learn the mechanics. They need that first 30, 40 seconds to at least try to figure out what the controls are. it's not like a roller coaster where, they sit your butt down and there's no learning curve. You do it, and a minute and a half later, you're back, you got your thrills, and it was worth the hour that you spent in line.
Yeah, let's just put it this way, Carl. If you charged me $2 a minute to do 7 minutes in heaven, that regular feature would not exist on this podcast.
I would need a whole heck of a lot more patron supporters.
Indeed. But I mean, it's the same, it's the same basic idea. Like, the players don't know what they're doing. They only have a very small number of minutes to figure it out. It's very similar to a lot of the flailing that goes on in 7 minutes in heaven, except it's even worse because even though I'm not the world's greatest game player, I am at least a video game player. The thing about these kind of amusement park, location-based entertainment kind of things is part of what they were trying to do was draw in people that would not normally do arcades. They were trying to draw in amusement park people that weren't necessarily game players. So you're going to have a lot of people that are like, oh, that looks cool, and come in and are completely lost even in how a traditional video game functions, making that learning curve even steeper. And they are paying a steep price for that steep learning curve.
Very, very true. I mean, what I don't see any of them doing, at least not in any of the reporting that we're getting, is trying to do what Wii Sports did. I mean, if you could if they had pulled off a Wii Sports with a really large screen and just simplified versions, I mean, not the super complicated golf simulations, which also exist at this point and we've talked about previously on the show, but just, straightforward, baseball batting without a real bat or something. Or, anything like that, it probably would have worked. But they're trying to go hardcore gamer type of programs with military grade realism and trying to sell that to the masses. It is just a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. So it's probably a good thing that Coinop has a backup plan because Coinop goes small.
British developer Attention to Detail, makers of Cybermorph for the Jaguar, have unveiled a new arcade hardware built around a 486 PC chip with an extra wide bus to facilitate easy porting of PC games to the arcades. Their first title, Gremlins Zool, will hopefully provide an affordable alternative to ever more expensive Coinop product.
Oh, a 486-based hardware in 1994. How exciting! Woo! I mean, look, obviously in one way they're ahead of their time because the entire industry in a few years is going to shift to just using generic PC architecture for arcade hardware. So, I mean, good on them for that, but 486 in 1994, just no. The appeal of the arcade is always predicated in part on it being on the cutting edge in some way, shape, or form. So you can't be using yesterday's processor today. By this time, the Pentium is the new hotness. Yes, it's still early in the Pentium's life. It's not like everyone has one yet, but this is the arcade. The Pentium is the new hotness. If you're making a hardware around the 486, what are you even doing?
Well, and it gets worse because not only are they building it around the 486, but they've also changed the board so much that you have to actually reprogram every game from scratch.
And what's the point in that?
And wait, I'm not done yet.
But wait, there's more.
Games.
Order in the next 30 minutes.
The two games that they put out on test are Zool, which if you've ever played Zool, well, yeah, and Rise of the Robots. Which
the fighting game that nobody wanted on console, now in the arcade.
Exactly, because it has such a great two-player mode. And so the payout from this is not good. It doesn't make the story, as far as I could tell online, is that it just doesn't make enough money on test for friend of the show, Frank Gasking, has a great article up on this on games that weren't, and he did a lot. He had a lot of research on this. So yeah, Rise of the Robots and Zool don't work. Now the board does apparently get a second life as a very simple bar memory and little mini game thing with a soccer theme.
That's
which
fair.
Makes perfect sense for this type of setup, and the fact that Attention to Detail was working with a fruit machine maker in England to create the product.
Yes. Well, that could make more sense. Countertop kind of bar games, you don't need as much sophistication. But yeah, I knew this was going to end up being a disastrous headline the moment you said makers of Cybermorph.
Yeah. I also thought, I almost didn't include it this month, but I thought it was a nice counterpoint to 10 years earlier when we had the wonderful attempt to use an Atari 8-bit computer as the guts of an arcade game in 1984. And so this was just a nice counterpoint to it of somebody taking the same idea. Let's use home computer hardware. That'll be a great thing for the arcades. And totally messing up the point of it.
Indeed. Moving on then to some bigger names in the space. Daytona gets new name.
Sega has announced that its upcoming racing game, Daytona GP, may be getting a new name before it debuts at the Acme Arcade Show due to ongoing negotiations with NASCAR. And so, yeah, apparently they wanted to get a NASCAR license on this, but NASCAR, the story goes, insisted that they stick to NASCAR type of racetracks. And of course, those are dull as dishwater.
Yeah.
And therefore, they decided, no, not doing that. And instead, they just went with Daytona USA. They use stock car looking vehicles, but there's no NASCAR license on anything.
I think the kids are going to be all right.
Just
gonna say.
Somehow the NASCAR license, not necessary for the success of that game. Giant fruit machine built into a mountainside, that is necessary for that game, but everything else, not so much.
But while Daytona is just going to be just fine, not everybody is just fine in the Coinop space right now as IREM shuts down arcade division.
While IRM's consumer side will continue, any future arcade game released in Japan would be licensed to American manufacturers.
Yeah, I mean, this is, we're right at the beginning here of the great collapse of the kind of Japanese coin-operated manufacturers where most of them either vanish or retreat into very, very specific niches. And it's the coming of 3D. The hardware is getting to the point that it's so expensive now that you need to be one of the big boys anymore. You can't be a smaller. There'd been so many small Japanese arcade developers, and they're going to start shaking out. And this is one of the first canaries in the coal mine right here with IREM.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, R-Type is just not going to grab the kids anymore once you've gone 3D. It's just a different ballgame altogether. So sad. But also it's the reversal of what we saw 10 years earlier where all the Japanese manufacturers were starting to set up operations in the States, were stopping the licensing of product to American companies. It's a 10-year phase that's just churning around at this point.
Absolutely. But coin-operated games is not the only location-based entertainment undergoing some technological changes here as karaoke goes CD.
Pioneer, long the leader in Laserdisc-based karaoke machines, has introduced the CLD V121G combo unit. So it combines a Laserdisc and CD-based karaoke player in one device. This is the first combo device meant for commercial use as a karaoke machine to use both Laserdiscs and CDs.
And when Pioneer is acknowledging that maybe it's going to be CD instead of Laserdisc, you know that's the wave of the future.
Oh, yes. Let's not forget, Laser Active is still a thing at this point. And this is important, obviously, because, number one, this is being reported on in Cashbox, which shows that karaoke is starting to pick up even in the U.S., but Laserdisc may have been one of the things holding karaoke back in the States. It was just too cumbersome, too much of a pain in the butt. The move to CD is going to make this a far more attractive technology. And let's face it, we've been talking about CD-ROM being the next big thing, and we're going to be talking about it more today. And it's just taken over one more area that used to be controlled by another format.
Absolutely. So that's about all from Coinop, which is not in its greatest period in this part of 1994. Now we will move on to a recurring theme in our last few jumps, video game violence, and we have a report that U.S. rating system to be in place by Christmas.
The Interactive Entertainment Industry Rating System Committee says that they will have a voluntary rating system labeling new products according to the level of sex and violence in time for this year's holiday buying season.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it really is remarkable. I mean, true kudos here. It really is remarkable that an industry that was so fractured, that was in so many different mediums, so many different types of entertainment, where the two leaders in the most lucrative part of the business, consoles, hated each other's guts. Actually, when their backs were against the law, were against the wall, I'm sorry, and the law, but I did mean wall.
Little Freudian slip there.
Yeah, came together very swiftly and not only put together a system, but put together a system that works and has needed very, very little change since its first implementation. They tweak it here and there, but it's kind of remarkable how successfully they did this when they were finally forced to.
That's true. And it came together. I mean, obviously, always take people's memories with a grain of salt. But if we go back to friend of the show, Greg Fischbach, and co-founder of Acclaim, when he talked about this in my interview with him, he portrays himself as one of the organizers of this. But also, let's face it, it's his product which is really fueling the fact that this is a problem for all of the manufacturers.
Yes.
If it's not for Mortal Kombat, if this was just Night Trap, Nintendo probably could have held themselves out.
Yeah.
But Nintendo couldn't ignore Mortal Kombat, especially knowing that Mortal Kombat 2 is coming down the pipeline. And Mortal Kombat 2 is on all the charts. It's just ripping up all the charts right now. There's nothing in Coinop that's quite as big. The only thing that's competing with it as far as revenue is NBA Jam, which is also an Acclaim property for console purposes. Midway,
right?
And we'll talk more about that in a moment.
Yeah, and Nintendo knew that they could not censor again, and I think having that very real business necessity, because as we talked in our last 90s jump, Yamauchi is not happy right now. He is not happy with the way that Nintendo got pigeonholed as a toy. And so there is no way that Nintendo can censor Mortal Kombat 2 like they censored Mortal Kombat. And so, yeah, the pressure's on, but they deliver. Everyone delivers. But it is not only in the U.S. Where change is afoot, as the UK rating system to start in March.
The European Leisure Software Publishers Association, aka ELSPA, has announced that starting in March, all game software would be labeled with a sticker showing if a program was suitable for people 0 to 10, 11 to 14, 15 to 17, or 18 plus. This is a self-regulation scheme that will see individual publishers working with the UK's Video Standards Council and retailers to ensure policing of the scheme, and the British Board of Film Classification will step in to deal with the expected 5% of products that will fall outside of the scheme's remit.
Yeah, and it's no surprise that the UK was able to get this together faster, both because a lot of the players are smaller, but also because they had also had, as we discussed in some of our 80s jumps, they'd already had the Video Nasties scandal in Britain. So they had already had experience with this idea of having to regulate a new medium, and they already had council set up. You know, there's a little more of a European-style nanny state. I don't mean it derogatorily. I'm just saying, kind of thing already in place. And so they can get up to speed much quicker than the U.S. can, for a lot of these reasons.
Yeah, and also if you look across Europe, let's say you go to a country like Spain, you only have one or two big distributors that are actually distributing everybody's product. Same situation in Germany. So you don't have a lot of companies, and we'll talk more about how companies like Nintendo and stuff are actually having to spend a lot of money to finally build up their own distribution networks around this time.
Right. Yeah.
So there is a definite feeling of, there's fewer bigger players to talk to in order to get this up and running.
Absolutely.
So.
But, of course, you've always got Trip Hawkins out there that has to do his own thing no matter what else is going on in the world. And so, in addition to these systems, 3DO issues rating system.
Not content to wait for the rest of the industry to act, 3DO has created their own rating systems for their games that will begin appearing on titles. Their ratings are E, 12, 17, and AO.
Yeah, I mean, obviously pretty much based on how it's done in the movies in the U.S., though it's interesting they chose 12 instead of 13 for that kind of teenage rating. But, yeah, I mean, they're basically just emulating the Motion Picture Association of America.
Yeah. And I think for 3DO, there's also a certain amount of urgency just because so much of their content has video segments in it.
Yes.
And so they probably are feeling that pressure because they have the high definition version, high definition by the standards of the day, version of Night Trap has just come out. They've got a bunch of other similar games coming out. And these ratings will show up on a handful of games prior to being replaced by the ESRB's rating system.
Yep.
Put a link to one of them in the show notes, the Moby Games entry for it, just so everybody can see what this rating system looked like on the boxes.
Absolutely. And moving on from violence, of course, being March, this is about the time that all the monthly publications finally start getting their CES reports in from back in January. So we have a few items related to the Consumer Electronics Show here, starting with current next-gen falters at CES.
As magazine articles about the January CES show in Las Vegas begin to get released, one thing is clear. 3DO, Jaguar, and CD32 all had less than stellar showings at CES, with Commodore relegated to a small room off the actual floor, Atari's offering Sans Alien vs. Predator not impressing, and 3DO's Trip Hawkins having to dodge questions about the actual number of units sold of the 3DO.
Yeah, this is just the most bizarre of all of the console transitions that we've ever had. I mean, maybe you could say the one that caused the whole North American industry to crash was more bizarre, and I get that, but it's such a weird console transition. Because you have these machines that just came out way too early and were focused, everyone was thinking multimedia was the future. And so you got this wave of multimedia machines. And you just have Atari doing whatever the heck it's doing. But still, and then it turns out that wasn't the answer after all. But it's a very confusing time, I think, in the technology, and that reflects in the choices made, and things were changing so fast in terms of what people believed could be done with the technology in the next generation that those companies that thought they were being bold by getting in at the early part of it actually ended up in a complete alternate reality of what this console generation would actually look like.
Very, very true. If you really want a good idea of just how weird this is, this month's issue of Edge magazine, the cover story is 3D World. It's got a giant screenshot from Ridge Racer on it, and it's
Ridge Racer. Remember that one? Sorry, I had to do it, Carl. I had to do it.
I understand. It's in your contract. It's okay. I know you're a Namco shill. It's okay. It's okay. No, but the cover story is that. Mm-hmm. But when you flip it open, the first page is all about how multimedia, so these FMV cutscenes are basically just created a upcoming lineup of boring, non-interactive, badly acted FMV garbage. And they're very disparaging about it. Yeah. That may be a future for non-gamers to bring more people into the hobby, but by lowering the real version, it's almost like the editors had written this ahead of time and then realized, no, actually 3D is a thing. There's this complete disconnect between the cover and this internal editorial.
That's very interesting.
And there's some great articles in there about upcoming 3D technology, as well as articles about how MPEG and all this stuff is reshaping gaming. So it's a very, very fascinating issue of Edge. Again, Edge is always basically the lead. It's like I could do 90% of my research. I could just read Edge and then maybe add some stuff from the other magazines and newspapers at this point. They really do see a little bit further, but you can tell it's like they came back from CES and are like, well, we were going to do this thing about FMV, but no. Because, well, transition.
Indeed, because Sega previews Saturn.
Sega showed off a sizzle reel of Saturn games at CES, including Daytona USA, Virtua Fighter, Clockwork Knight, Virtua Soccer, and Panzer Dragoon. The presentation was actually overlooked by many magazines, with Edge talking about how those less keen observers would have missed it, as the bulk of attention at Sega's booth was still directed at the still lucrative 16-bit market.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this a little more a few headlines from now, so I don't want to beat this to death yet, but one thing that's become very clear to me in my more recent research on Sega is that Sega of America was not okay with the Saturn. They were just not okay with it. And I think this is an early example of that. They're kind of burying the Saturn and focusing on the Genesis because they're convinced, I'm pretty sure, that there's not going to be a market for it, not a big market for it, primarily because of the cost. And we can talk about that a little more a few headlines from now. But, I just, that part about most people missing it because it was so buried deep in the booth, I think that's just another sign of what Sega America feels about this console transition.
Definitely. And it really is a thing that several of the magazines this month don't even mention, that the Saturn was being shown on this big multi-screen display.
Right.
And the fact that, and this is one of the interesting bits, they don't show any 2D games. I mean, Clockwork Knight, it's sort of 2D, but it's got the 3D effects in the background and everything else. The fact that they're only showing 3D games for the Saturn, Sega has realized they need to lean into 3D.
Absolutely. As soon as the the PlayStation demos, the T-Rex demo and whatnot, started making the rounds, Sega realized they screwed up. And just to clarify, I mean, we're not telling the same old myths that Sega didn't think 3D was a thing and Sega hated 3D. And it's like, no. They did design the Saturn with the idea that 3D would start by the end of the generation to take over. But they really did think that at the beginning of the generation, when all of the programmers and developers were still very inexperienced with 3D, that it was going to be a largely 2D market at first, slowly transitioning into 3D, and then the PlayStation just completely upended that.
Yeah, exactly. And so, they're trying to position it now. This is a 3D console. But yeah, they're just burying it. Sega America, I think you're right, just has no confidence that this thing has a future.
Absolutely. Tom Kalinske is saying the Saturn is not in our future. I kid, but people who know the reference. But that is a joke.
Yes.
But Sega... maybe it's better to be overlooked compared to what's happening with Sega's competitor, as Nintendo fools no one with SGI demos.
A common thread in virtually every report about CES is that the real-time demos set up by Nintendo and Silicon Graphics to promote the upcoming Project Reality seemed farcical. Running on a 4-chip Onyx computer, the demos, while impressive, made no one believe that the $100,000 system's performance would have any resemblance to what the actual $250 Project Reality console would deliver. The buzzword vaporware was bandied about.
Ooh, that's cold. But, obviously, they were all correct. I mean, I wish we knew more about the N64's development. Certainly we know more than we used to, thanks to our very own Department of Corrections, Ethan Johnson, who's interviewed some people over there. But one thing we do know from some of the early developers that have been interviewed is that partway through their development cycle on their first games, they were told, oh, by the way, the N64 is going to be like half as powerful as we told you it was going to be. So, yeah, I don't think Nintendo was, obviously there's a little cloak and dagger going on here because, of course, an Onyx workstation is going to run stuff better than a $250 console no matter how you shake it. So, there was a little bit of puffery going on here, but I do think they honestly did believe at this time that they were going to deliver something closer to that level of performance. Not entirely that level, but closer to that level of performance than what the N64 did deliver in the end. And of course, they had to drastically cut back their expectations in that respect.
I'll give you that. I think that they would... They did think it would perform better than it actually ended up performing. But, and this is something that just over the last 5 years of doing the podcast and looking at the historical record, Nintendo has this very, very bad habit of any time the competition looks like it's ahead of them, of coming out with some outlandish claim of what will be theirs.
That's fair.
It's, we will have the backwards compatibility. We will do this. We'll have our CD system, and it will do this, and it's going to have a 32-bit processor. No, it'll have a 64-bit processor. All this nonsense. This is them thinking, oh, crap, somebody's going to be talking about PlayStation. Somebody's going to be talking about Sega Saturn. We need 3DO is there. We need to show them up. And they set this up as if anybody is buying it. At this point, there's just this cynicism at this point.
Oh, yeah.
After so many failed or vaporware announcements that the press is just like, yeah, Nintendo, whatever.
No, and that's totally fair. Just to be clear, I wasn't saying that even the more souped up N64, I'm sure would have been nowhere near what was being demoed on an actual Onyx workstation. Not trying to imply that.
Oh no, of course.
I'm just saying. I think the reality ended up being even worse than anticipated because they did have to make some tough choices on system specs as development wore on.
Oh, definitely. And, well, there's going to be some tough choices for the third parties as well, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Indeed. Meanwhile, however, let's go on to some other impressive 3D demos going on as Acclaim the Duel demo details.
We talked last month about how Acclaim's The Duel 3D rendered demo wowed audiences at a tech show in Japan and wondered if this was in fact a product of their motion capture studio. Electronic Games Magazine confirms our suspicions this month that the demo is in fact the result of data collected in the motion capture studio. No word on when it will be used to make games, though.
Yeah, no, Acclaim was really ahead of the curve on the motion capture. It's a shame they didn't always have the best products to pair with their motion capture, but there's no doubt they were pretty impressive. I mean, I know, of course, you've talked to Greg, and I've also talked to Wes Trauger, who was the guy who was actually, in charge of all of that advanced technology stuff at Acclaim. And yeah, it's pretty impressive. But that thing about no word on it will be used in games to make games, I mean, that's pretty telling, because obviously they do use it in their games and use it to good effect in their games, but they don't exactly have games worth hyping this technology over. And I think that's very telling that they don't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and again, we'll talk about Acclaim a lot more in a few moments, but a lot of their development is still porting stuff from the arcades or making 2D games for consoles. It's not until 3D consoles really hit the market that they're going to be able to employ this. And when I talked to Greg, he very clearly was like, nobody had seen 3D tech like this before. And I think he misstated a little bit. He was connecting that with Turok. Right. But what I think he was really talking about was this demo. Because that makes a lot more sense. Absolutely. From a timeline standpoint. Because by the time Turok shows up, everybody has seen 3D at that point.
Yes.
But, they're there. They're showing what's possible. And I think that that future of 3D is really what we're seeing at the CES.
Absolutely. And of course, if you're going to be part of that future of 3D, you're going to need to have some kind of development pipeline that can handle it. So it's no surprise that 3D tool makers show wares at CES.
The Consumer Electronics Show is mainly an event for manufacturers to show their latest and upcoming consumer goods to retailers, but this year the dawn of multimedia and 3D rendered graphics has brought some developers of 3D hardware and software for development use to the show as well. Alias, Softimage, and Wavefront were among those showing off their products, which is astonishing in an industry dominated so far by Autodesk's 3D Studio. 3D software company Wavefront showed off their GameWare package, which cost $15,000, which, according to PowerPlay magazine, seemed to be primarily designed for the use with fighting games. Softimage showed off their tools, which, among others, had been used to develop Sega's Virtua Racing. Many software publishers, including Acclaim, Capcom, Konami, and Hudson, have already purchased Softimage software. Silicon Graphics had 3 connected machines running their Onyx Reality Engine and a pterodactyl flight simulator by Angel Studios to promote Nintendo's upcoming Project Reality. And yeah, that's sort of a...
the whole world is changing because, of course, it's not just... this is bigger than video games because the motion picture industry is in the midst of a huge revolution in CGI as well that's going to need the same kind of programs. And, of course, we're just about to the dawn of, it's another year away. Toy Story is launching and the entire animation industry is going to be switching over to computer-generated imagery. So this is one story that is just so far beyond what's going on in video games, but obviously video games is playing a central role in it as well.
Yeah, and in a way, this is also the professionalization of middleware is starting at this point. These are now tools that are going to become standard tools. GameWare is going to become the official package for developing on the Jaguar. SoftImage is going to become the official package for developing on the Saturn. And
you didn't put it in your note, but I mean, Angel Studios was, or not, it wasn't Angel, I'm sorry, but Nintendo has also brought on a company, Paradigm, specifically because they had experience in 3D and could develop tools that were widely applicable as well on the Project Reality side of things.
Oh, definitely. And what we're also saying, there's no reason for these companies to be at CES because they're not selling products to retailers.
Exactly.
But they're at CES because this is the only place where they're going to be able to show off their wares to developers who are also at CES. This is showing that CES has become the major place for video game companies to be, but it's not really the right place for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also going to be the last, you could say the last great video game CES. No, I mean, we still have the summer one coming.
The infamous summer one.
Yes, the infamous summer one is coming. And E3 will be after that.
Absolutely. But yeah, no, that is a very cogent point. I mean, this shows very well that the industry needs its own show because, yeah, these guys really don't belong in a CES, but it's where they need to be to reach their constituents, even if it's not the traditional CES constituent.
True. And now one other interesting side note, and this also comes from German magazine Power Play, and they bemoan that while Unix renderers are better than 3D Studio Max, the Autodesk software has taken the industry by storm, and the magazine predicts that soon the entire industry will be flooded with flicks, movies, masquerading as cutscenes that will bore us all to death. Even the rides in Bullfrog's theme park game are being created as pre-rendered elements. And they're like, why? You're only getting one angle from of them. There's no point in this. They're like, this mania of 3D pre-rendered graphics makes no sense for most games.
Absolutely.
And they will sadly be correct. But
indeed.
At least for a little bit.
All right, turning our attention from CES to next-gen console announcements generally, Sega of America announces 32X.
Yes. This comes out middle of March, so March 15th or so. So it's well after CES, which is an important context, I think. Sega's US division has announced a $150 add-on for their 16-bit Genesis console, the Sega Genesis Super 32X, due out in the autumn. The add-on will be able to draw up to 60,000 polygons per second and have 2 Hitachi processors capable of executing 40 million instructions per second. Denise Caruso of Technologies and Media, a San Francisco-based industry newsletter, said, quote, "If Nintendo doesn't mimic this, they'll be in trouble." End quote.
Yeah, and, you know, I just revisited the 32X recently on my own podcast when discussing the Saturn because they're really interlinked. You know, the stories of these two are really interlinked. And there's a lot of misinformation out there about what the 32X was. This was actually a full collaboration between America and Japan, like actually working together. And it really came down to the fact that Sega of America did not believe that people would pay for a Saturn. And analysts agreed. I mean, there are a lot of articles from this time period in newspapers where analysts are saying, you know, once we know the price, once we know it's going to be a $400 console, analysts saying the public is not going to buy this at $400. Because, I mean, you know, there has never really been, even with a decade of inflation or even a decade and a half of inflation, some of that which was massive stagflation, there has never really been a successful mainstream console. Most of them have been $200. You have a couple that are very briefly $250, think in television's briefly even higher than that. But like, there's been this $200 price barrier that has been near universal, despite the fact that, $200 in 1993 is not in any way the same thing as $200 in 1983. I mean, it's kind of remarkable. And so that's sticker shock, even though technically a VCS at $200 in 1977 was even more expensive than a Saturn at $499 in 1995. There's a real, I think, psychological barrier here. And this is not just me stating my opinion. I mean, this is what the analysts were saying in the papers too, that it's like, when you have these cheaper 16-bit systems, who's going to pay $400 for a console? And Sega of America, quite frankly, agreed with that, from all the research I've done. And they felt that they needed an entree to the next generation that would not break the bank. And then they were also very concerned about curating the 16-bit market, which they saw is still going strong and didn't expect was about to fall off a cliff. And so they wanted to not only provide a cheaper entree into the next generation, but also one that did not leave their incredibly loyal and extensive 16-bit install base in the United States behind. And so that's how some very well-intentioned people came up with a very disastrous product. But as you can see, even the analysts at the time were like, okay, this makes sense. And the retailers would be too, because they'd order a bunch of them. And then, reality, of course, comes crashing down on actual release. But I know that's a bit of a long-winded discussion of this, but it's just, I just delved into this recently, and I think it's kind of worth, explaining, what the heck Sega was thinking.
And I totally agree with all of that, because there was a comment, I believe it was in EGM, maybe 5 months ago at this point, where they said, if they bring out the Saturn, and this was before we had seen any screenshots or anything, if they bring out the Saturn and their launch title is Virtua Fighter, you're screwed. Mm-hmm. And there is no product. I mean, Daytona hasn't hit yet. Daytona is going to obviously be the game that could potentially move units.
Yes.
But that hasn't hit yet. That's not out yet. And when the Saturn launches in the US with those very not polished titles that are not going to really impress, at a price tag that, like you said, it's twice what the regular consoles are, it's going to be a hard sell. The PlayStation is going to have the advantage of the price. It's going to have the advantage that it has much better looking titles. If you're going to charge extra, you better be providing something. And I mean, the 32X, it seems like a good idea, but it's just going to be a problem. And it really comes also down, and the context here is important for a couple of things. Number one, they didn't show it at CES.
It didn't exist yet.
2 months. Well, that's the thing.
They came up with it. They literally came up with it at CES. I mean, we have interviews from people. I mean, they'd been thinking about something before CES, but it was at CES that they actually decided, let's make this dual Hitachi processor add-on to the Genesis. Literally at CES.
And there's another factor here, I think, that is important. And this was something else that several magazines talked about at CES. 2 games keep getting compared with one another. One of them is Virtua Racer for the Genesis, which has a new add-on chip built into it. Makes the game very, very run very, very well. And the second Super FX chip game for the Super Nintendo is being showed off, which is Super Track or Super Racer FX or whatever it was. Stunt Racer FX?
Stunt Racer FX, I believe, yeah.
Yeah, which runs like garbage. I mean, it really is a terrible frame rate, etc. And those 2 games are constantly being compared with one another, with Virtua Racer being considered the much better game, but they're predicting a retail price tag of $100 for the game at that point.
Yeah. Which
is prohibitive. And in light of that, it makes sense. We can't keep releasing $100 cartridges for a $99 system. And we've talked about this. You've brought this up multiple times very accurately. You can't have that disparate price between cartridge and console. Mm-hmm. It can't be the same or more expensive. But so the 32X, in light of that comparison, makes so much more sense. But yeah I mean, it's and they were expecting, the 8-bit to 16-bit generational jump. It was a bit of a slow burn. I mean, obviously Sega comes out much earlier than Nintendo does, so the Mega Drive, the Genesis, because Sega doesn't have the same foothold, I mean, gets buried by the NES, even in the US, for the first couple of years. And even after the Super NES comes out and both companies are competing in the 16-bit realm, that NES persists for a while longer, still having a modicum of success. And I really think that Sega, having just barely become the market leader in this generation, I think that they thought that they were going to have perhaps a similar slow glide down on the 16-bit compared to the 32-bit. But what actually happens is, while obviously the Genesis market doesn't vanish overnight, but after 1995, once you hit 1996 and everyone, including Nintendo, has their big new system out, that 16-bit market basically just does kind of fall off a cliff way more suddenly than I think the 8-bit market did. I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I'm going out on a limb, being a little bit uncautious here, but I believe that's accurate. And so I think they anticipated the Genesis being a little more evergreen than it was, and therefore still being a viable platform to sell an add-on for, even with the expensive next generation consoles coming. Because of course they assumed that the PlayStation was going to be $400. Yeah.
They were operating under that assumption as well. They were not expecting to be undercut $100 on price. If they had known the PlayStation was going to be $300, I do have to wonder, and this is it's alternate history, who knows, but I do have to wonder if they knew that at this time, if they would not have taken a different approach, trying to get down the cost of the Saturn rather than trying to do this add-on for the Genesis, because that $299 was just I know it's overdone, but it really did just completely change those dynamics, and it really left no place for the 32X, if the 32X even had a place at all, which is debatable. It definitely didn't have one after the PlayStation was announced at that relatively cheap price.
Yeah, the 32X against a $299 PlayStation, because once you buy the Genesis plus the 32X, you're not that far off of $299. And so, yeah, that immediately kills it. Number two, I don't think Sega would have launched the Saturn, period, if they had known Sony was coming in at $299. Mm-hmm. I think they probably would have pushed the 32X and tried to get the price down to $75 or $50.
Yeah. Before
the PlayStation came out. They could have just said, you know what? Screw it. Saturn gets backburned for another 2 years so we can get it up and running, and then release the Neptune, the combo unit, at, $129 or something, and be like, yeah, you can spend $300 on the PlayStation, or here we got Hamster Ball for the Neptune, or whatever the game was.
Yeah.
That's an alternate history. I don't think they really believed Sony would take such a hit on the hardware.
No.
Going into E3.
Nobody did. I mean, I'm sure we'll cover this in our later jumps, but, Sam Trammell started raging loudly in every magazine that would listen to him that they were dumping, Yeah. Which is illegally selling for way less. And, it was a combination. I mean, yes, some of it is they decided in America to take a bigger loss than the Japanese were willing to take. That's a big part of it. They also did remove a little bit of functionality, one of the video out formats, I forget which one, which also reduced the price a little. Though the big thing was Sony Computer Entertainment in America and Sony ImageSoft decided that it was worth taking the bigger loss. And they literally all got fired for it, which is the fascinating thing. Like, really? Japan was not happy. Oh, yeah, that was a big part of why Steve Race was fired. And Olaf Olofsson was not fired, but he was reassigned to another part of Sony that had nothing to do with video games. And it was because the Japanese were furious. We should really be talking about this when we get to that jump, I suppose. But,
we've got so much left to do. Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, the Japanese were furious, but that's a large part of why the 32X just had no place to go, I think. But speaking of that PlayStation, well, we're not ready to announce a price on it just yet. The PSX is shown to UK devs.
At an NDA-burdened event in London, developers were shown Sony's upcoming PlayStation X tech. The enthusiastic devs walked away claiming it was the massive leap forward that they expected from Nintendo's system, and the tools and simple dev systems will make jumping into it not a problem. The focus on games as opposed to multimedia also seems to bode well for the new system.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it before and we'll talk about it again, but I mean, Sony just does everything right. It's that famous Trip Hawkins quote where I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it in front of me, where he said, for being a new company, you'd have hoped they'd have made more mistakes by now. He basically says at one point later on, it's just they have such great tech. They understand that they need to push 3D, that it's the future, and they can't be held back by FMV or sprites or anything. They just have to go all in on this one paradigm. And, of course, it's the correct paradigm, as history bears out. And they just make it as easy as possible to develop for under the circumstances. And it's just, I mean, how are you not going to be impressed as a game developer? And indeed, every developer, once they see those demos running, even though it's the usual caveat, it can push that many polygons when you don't have particles and fog and whatever. But still, I mean, it's just such a poster child for how to do it, which is so hilarious because then they do the PS3, which throws out everything that they did on the PS1. But, that's a story for another time.
But you have motion controls in that awesome controller. Sorry.
So, yeah. So that's what Sony's doing. Meanwhile, 3DO, perhaps feeling a little bit of pressure here, announces new licensees and a PC add-on card.
The 3DO company says it has added Gold Star and Samsung as licensees of their hardware standard and have signed a deal with the Creative Technology Limited Company to develop a card that allows PCs to run 3DO software. Yeah. Well, okay, so Gold Star doesn't really count because it's a Matsushita company. So it's not really adding another licensee. Samsung is a new licensee. And the PC add-on card thing actually is a little bit interesting just because, as we talked last month, 3D accelerator cards are slowly beginning to emerge on the PC scene.
Yep. So I do have to stop you there. Okay. Because you are incorrect.
Okay.
Gold Star is a Korean company, and it is the company that is today LG Electronics.
I thought LG was a different one. Okay, Gold Star is LG. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so it's a Korean company. Okay, I stand corrected. For some reason, I thought it was part of the Matsushita thing. But okay, cool.
No.
Got ahead of you, Ethan. Alex got ahead of you.
Yeah, I knew it was a Korean company, but I just looked up to be absolutely certain that it had no Matsushita connection before I said something.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
But it is interesting because, of course, these are the Koreans coming in, and, I mean, they probably know at this point, because it's already pretty obvious that the 3DO is going nowhere. But this is an opportunity for very little risk for these up-and-coming Korean electronics companies to learn a little bit about what's going on with some of this technology. And I think, and I don't know this, I don't have an interview or anything, but I'm imagining that's why they joined at this point, because Korea is in the process of transforming into an electronics powerhouse. And this, they probably saw as a great way to, like, get a little knowledge without having to really expose themselves very much.
Very, very true. That makes a lot of sense under these circumstances because, yeah, they're not a player yet. Mm-hmm. And, yeah, why not? I mean, they already are making, VCRs and stuff like that, so they've got some distribution channel. Throw it out there, see what happens, and get a little bit of a feel.
Exactly.
Makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm. But while the 3DO may be going PC, other PC companies are not necessarily so eager to go console, as Microsoft won't provide an OS for Saturn.
Sega of America's Director of Marketing, Stephen Payne, has clarified to the Financial Times that the previously announced collaboration between Microsoft and Sega on the upcoming Sega Saturn is not for the providing of an OS for the new console. Microsoft was also quick to point out that they are still focused and will continue to focus primarily on PC software. The software Microsoft will supply is expected to be a software interface for the CD-ROM drive in the new console that will take both cartridges and discs.
Yep, so this is Microsoft beginning to tiptoe around the living room because they are starting to get a little bit concerned about what a console in the living room can do, but they're not fully activated there yet. It's more like they want to be in the know and want to have a partner there in case it becomes an issue in the future. And this is me speculating. I mean, I'm not saying I know this, but that's the sense I get, is that they want their finger on the pulse, their ear to the ground, because they're afraid that maybe someday this may be a thing. But they're not really that interested in it yet.
No, and we will see a later story about Microsoft today where that whole idea of being in the living room and figuring out what role computer technology is going to have in mass entertainment is going to be far more crystallized as we talk about the internet. But so Microsoft is definitely interested in finding out what's going on. Obviously, this relationship is going to blossom later on a little bit more on the Dreamcast. But it's interesting that it's already here, but they're very, very quick to note. I mean, this was, they're telling the Financial Times, no, we're not part of this, probably so that nobody starts speculating on the stocks in both cases.
Absolutely. And then moving on to a prominent next-generation developer, Crystal Dynamics signs on for Saturn development.
After making the 3DO pack-in title Crash and Burn, Crystal Dynamics has announced that they will also be developing titles for Sega's upcoming Saturn 3D console.
Yeah, and, Crystal Dynamics at this point isn't the biggest developer in the world, but we do have to remember that they were basically founded to make 3DO software. David Morse hijacked the company for that. It was actually founded by a couple of ex-Sega people, but then David Morse came in and hijacked it to make it kind of the software arm in a way, unofficially, of 3DO. So the fact that they're pivoting towards Saturn is a clear indication that some developers really close to Tripp's company are no longer seeing a viable path forward on the 3DO.
Yeah, and there's an interesting comment in Edge's coverage of CES basically saying at the 3DO stand, the only software worth looking at was Crystal Dynamics software. Because, they're doing games like Total Eclipse. I believe Total Eclipse was theirs as well. And they're like, there's only Crystal Dynamics. It's the only reason to buy a 3DO, if at all, at this point. So, and if they're going to bring those games to Sega, to the Saturn, what's the point?
Absolutely. But meanwhile, across the pond, they're trying to pretend they're part of the next generation too, as CD32 heralds CD revolution in UK.
Gallup reports that the biggest selling CD games format in the UK is Commodore CD32, outselling both the Sega Mega CD and PC CD-ROM with 38% of the market just 6 months after its introduction. Amiga Computing Magazine reports, though, that the PC's market share is growing at the expense of the Mega CD market share, while the CD32's market seems to be stagnating.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Commodore's a big name in the UK, and I mean, if you decide I've got to have a CD system today, and your choice is the Mega CD or the CD32, I mean, yeah, that's a pretty obvious choice. But, you know, the thing holding back PC CD-ROM had always been the expense, but now with some of the killer apps that have come out, like The Seventh Guest, like Myst, we're starting to get to the point where mass adoption in the United States in particular is beginning to drive down those prices. And so, you know, once that price barrier is gone, yeah, there's no way that these are all going to be also rans to PC CD-ROM.
Yeah, well, at this point, we haven't had any PC reviews of Myst yet. At this point, we're still dealing with
coming
Mac.
out.
Yeah,
it's just coming out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So just saying, we will get to Myst as a port to PCs, because some of the reviews of that will be very interesting to read, and we will probably be commenting on them, similar to the way we commented on some of the reviews of The Seventh Guest when it came out, due to their entertainment value. But you're right. It's the price is an issue. The CD32, Commodore's name is still carries weight in Europe, but it's basically a very, very small light in a very, very dark tunnel for Commodore, as we will see. But
indeed. But now moving on to the 16-bit generation, still ongoing, Nintendo announces Super Game Boy.
Nintendo has announced a new device that will allow users to play Game Boy games on their TVs through their SNES systems. The device will cost $59.99.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really stupid product, but, you know, at the same time, I owned one, so.
Well, this got me thinking about two things. And number one, I disagree that it's a stupid product. Because I think that it really is I thought it was a super cool product when I first heard about it. Due to the simple fact that I always found the Game Boy screen so unbearably bad, but I knew that there were a lot of good games in there.
Right.
So I thought it was a great way to, you know, play these games in a bigger format. But then again, I was the guy who
clarify,
still wanted to play C64 games.
To clarify, it was a stupid product at $60.
Good point. At $60, a stupid product.
Yeah. Now, yeah, and it didn't ultimately end up being that successful. Now, I had one. I never had a Game Boy until even later than this. So because I just wasn't interested in gaming on the go, and I wasn't interested in dealing with that screen. So yeah, there was a very small subset of consumers that at least I was a part of that it was a good thing. I wanted to play Link's Awakening. I wanted to play Metroid 2. And this allowed me to do so without picking up a Game Boy, which I didn't want. So yeah, I bought one. But realistically speaking, the vast majority of people who had Game Boys were not going to pay $60 just to have the privilege to play those games on their CRT. Now, of course, it ended up being doubly silly, though they couldn't predict this at the time, because of course they thought that this was just a let's suck a little more life out of the Game Boy library because the Game Boy's about dead. I mean, they weren't riding on this to be a super hit. I just figured they thought that Game Boy sales are way down. We're at the end of the life of the product. This may be a way to just juice a few more sales out of it. Then, of course, Pokemon comes along, which not just revives the Game Boy market, but is specifically dependent on having actual Game Boys and trading Pokemon via link cables. So that just makes, a few years later, the Super Game Boy even more redundant. But it does make a little sense as an end-of-life product. It just turned out that we weren't quite at the end of the Game Boy's life after all. Spoiler alert.
Yeah. It's got another decade.
Indeed.
Yeah. But from what I found also interesting about this is this doesn't get announced at CES. This feels like it should have been something announced at CES, and it gets announced the same day in the same newspapers as the 32X. And it just felt like a weird, they've got an add-on for their console. What can we have as an add-on for our console?
Right.
Coincidence? I don't know. But this idea of we're going to add something that provides some new functionality to the console, it was just weird that it's happening. Both of them are being announced or coming out in newspapers on the 15th of March.
Indeed.
Don't know.
I agree. But also not everything is rosy at Nintendo at the moment either, as Nintendo still smug despite share price collapse.
Yes, and now this is being reported in the Nikkei Weekly in Japan on March 28th. Timeline is going to be a little bit interesting here for a couple of articles. After Nintendo's downward revision of its earnings estimates late last year and continued anxiety about competitors in and entering the market, Nintendo's stock has dropped to 1/5 of its high. This despite having massive pre-tax profits of $1.14 billion for the year through March 1994. And this is a pre-tax profit to sales ratio of 24%. This profit margin may explain the smugness of its CEO, Hiroshi Yamauchi, who continues to bully the rest of the industry. When Capcom began releasing games for Sega's Genesis, he summoned Capcom president Kenzo Tsujimoto to a meeting at Nintendo's head office, after which Tsujimoto reconfirmed that Nintendo's platforms were its main priority. Nintendo also still holds an exclusive relationship with Square Company, and by the end of January had already received 2.55 million orders from retailers for Final Fantasy VI, which will retail at a whopping 11,400 yen, 16% higher than Part 5. Since Nintendo outsources its production of games to third parties and has a stranglehold on the industry group the Shoshinkai, Yamauchi can justify considering the entry of hardware makers like Matsushita, which admits to not being able to get enough software for its 3DO systems, and Sony as folly. Yeah, so, pissing off or bullying people like the head of Capcom may backfire on you when a competitor like Sony shows up. And, well, how many games does Capcom release on the N64? According to Moby Games, 3. Do not ask how many they release for PlayStation.
Though in fairness, Capcom does remain pretty loyal to Nintendo, because they actually do release Resident Evil 2 on the N64. And the concept of releasing Resident Evil 2 on the N64 is so utterly ridiculous that that's because of some deep-seated relationship there. But yeah, absolutely. Nobody likes the bullying, and nobody likes the direction that they take with a lot of the system specs, especially CD-ROM versus cartridges. So, and of course, in our Department of Corrections, I talked about, Capcom didn't like the Famicom disk system, and so they came up with a technological alternative to ignore something they didn't like. And, certainly a lot of the Japanese companies are doing that here when Nintendo is trying to bully them into continuing to use cartridges when CD is just so obviously the future. But yeah, still smug. That share price is going down, though, because even though it is true that they have some pretty impressive pre-tax profits, showing up at this time. We are going to learn just a couple of days later that Nintendo profits expected to fall by 40%.
On March 31st, the Japan Economic Newswire reported that analysts expected Nintendo Company of Japan to report consolidated pre-tax profits of 100 billion yen for the 1993 fiscal year ending on the 31st, a 40% drop over the previous year and 20 billion yen less than earlier projections. The loss is attributable in part to a decrease in European revenue and the high cost of setting up new distribution subsidiaries. Sales are expected to be 20% lower than the previous year at 500 billion yen.
Yep, this is what I like to call, and I've called on my own podcast, the crash that wasn't. The industry is teetering at this point, and Nintendo's numbers here are a part of that. Yes, they let Sega grab more market share in the U.S. Yes, they got a little bit of a black eye or perhaps a ripped-out spine from their Mortal Kombat decision. But it's not just about Sega taking more of the market. This is about a general decline that we are seeing at this exact moment in the video game industry, where there just isn't a lot of faith right now, because the early next-gen systems, the multimedia systems, have been flops. The later 3D systems that are coming seem like they're just going to be exorbitantly expensive. And meanwhile, in the current generation, you just are mostly getting the same rehashes of the same types of games and gameplay that have been going on since the NES first launched. Better graphics, sure, but not a lot of revolution in the type of gameplay that we're seeing. So you throw all of that together, and it's easy to forget now once the PlayStation became such a runaway success, but this was really not that great a time for the video game industry.
Yeah, I mean, and it really looks like, it feels almost like consoles have nothing good or new to offer.
Mm-hmm.
3D on the new systems is way too weak. 3DO and so forth. FMV is a no-starter as far as gameplay is concerned, and you can't do another jump and run. You can't just do another bird's eye view action RPG. You need to do something new. And like you said, it's general, because Sega is also expected to show a dip in profits, the first in 12 years, and won't announce a stock split the first time it hasn't done so in 7 years.
Yep, and it's not being reported here. It may be reported in other jumps, but we're going to learn that Konami is going to lose money for the first time in a while. We're going to learn that Capcom and Data East have way too much inventory in the channel that they can't sell, and Capcom's going to nearly go bankrupt out of that, and Data East starts its decline to complete irrelevancy. It's like, the vultures are circling here at this point, and, it's still not dire yet. Nintendo and Sega are still profitable, but it's looking a lot like that calm before the storm in the great crash of 83, because profits are falling, inventory is backing up, people are getting tired of the same old games and clones of all the same concepts, and the console transition so far, by which I mean the early adopters, the 3DOs and Jaguars of the world, has been completely botched, just as like the 5200 transition was botched by Atari. So it's looking a lot like echoes of 1982-83 at this point.
And like we just mentioned with Final Fantasy VI, the innovative or really big games that are doing new things are costing a fortune because those cartridges are getting so big.
Exactly.
Unlike Mega Turrican, which was still a very, very small 4 megabit game, primarily because they couldn't afford to go bigger. I mean, It's a Data East release.
Yep.
They just couldn't go any bigger and still pay the licensing fees and everything else. But the game suffers for it. I mean, you can't be graphically spectacular when you only got 4 megabits to work with.
Absolutely. Though it is not all doom and gloom for everybody in the video game industry, as Acclaim reports record earnings.
Acclaim Entertainment announced record earnings of $127.4 million for the quarter ending November 30th, 1993, a 62% increase year over year. Net income was $12.3 million compared to $6.3 million the year before.
Mortal Kombat is a hell of a drug, Carl.
Yeah. And this is all happening before NBA Jam numbers hit.
Exactly. Because another marketing blitz from Acclaim is on the way as the NBA Jam launch to match Mortal Kombat.
NBA Jam Day, the March 4th launch of the home ports of NBA Jam by Acclaim, is being heralded as a massive hit. Nearly 2 million units of the game were shipped for the launch day, and 55,000 units were being pre-sold. The sports game could match or even beat Acclaim's ports of Mortal Kombat, which launched 6 months earlier and have already sold over 5 million units so far, in no small part thanks to being less controversial.
Yeah, I mean, these are the big third-party games of 93-94. Mortal Kombat, Mortal Kombat 2, NBA Jam, and it is all happening at Acclaim Entertainment.
Exactly. And at the same time that those announcements are hitting, we have a new announcement.
Yes, because there may be some partners in all of this that are not so happy to see all of these record earnings at companies that are not them, which is why Midway dumps Acclaim.
Acclaim Entertainment Incorporated saw its shares tumble March 31st after Nintendo said it had reached an exclusive licensing deal with WMS Industries, owners of Midway, the makers of the arcade originals Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam, Acclaim's two biggest console properties. The stock had already been falling all week on speculation that Acclaim's licensing contract with WMS may be coming to an end, but the stock fell from almost $19 a share to just $13.75 on the Nintendo News, and has halved since its high of $26 earlier in the month. The deal between Acclaim and WMS is expected to expire in March 1995, so it won't have an immediate impact on Acclaim's bottom line. Nintendo and WMS will create a new company, Williams Nintendo Incorporated, to sell video games for Nintendo's Project Reality console.
Yeah, people aren't stupid. People know where Acclaim's success came from, and it wasn't brilliant original content. It was entirely based on that absolutely bonkers right of first refusal deal they signed with Midway. I mean, it wasn't bonkers at the time, but it just turned into such a lopsided arrangement.
Yeah, I mean, Midway hadn't had really earth-shattering release since what? Miss Pac-Man at this point? I mean, and the fact that Mortal Kombat would be this big and NBA Jam immediately afterwards was something that I don't think anybody was counting on. So, Acclaim's making a ton of money. Midway wants a bigger piece of that. They want all of it, let's face it. Again, check out my interview with Greg Fischbach. We go into this in great detail. And, so now the clock is ticking. Acclaim's got a year to get its house in order and get some properties of its own to do this. Of course, we will see an Acclaim arcade division open because that's the ticket, right?
All the big hits come from the arcade and always will forever. So this next one we already mostly talked about, but just to dot the I's, cross the T's, Sega shows off virtual racing on Genesis.
Sega wowed audiences at CES with their virtual racing port for the Genesis using Sega's Virtua processor chip. It left Nintendo's 3D follow-up to Star Fox Stunt Racer FX looking old. Yeah, we already talked about this, And this was really a common theme in all the magazines this month, like I already said. These two got pitted against one another. One thing that I did leave out here, and we haven't mentioned yet, was at CES, Sega was showing off a demo of the new AT&T based online play option for the Genesis, and it was using virtual racing. So they actually had Tom Kalinske on one side of the convention hall and the head of AT&T at the other side playing against one another.
Nice.
But,
outside of the traditional video game sphere, Playmates Toys gets into games.
Yes, toy maker Playmates, best known for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles toys, has decided to get into games. They'll start off with 2 Novotrade developed titles, Deep Space Nine and Exo Justice, and have also signed a deal with David Perry of Aladdin, Cool Spot, and Trantor the Last Stormtrooper fame to develop titles. The first should be out by November.
I see what you did there. David Perry is not famous for Trantor the Last Stormtrooper, Mr. Trantornator.
In my world, he is. Well, at least for the Amstrad CPC version.
Absolutely. No, you're good. I just had to point that out.
No. If I was going to mention three games he worked on, it sure as hell wasn't going to be a McDonald's tie-in. Let's just put it that way.
Indeed. But yeah, I mean, Playmates, they've basically been a one-hit wonder with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And, the saying in the toy industry is that no toy has a third Christmas. And obviously, TMNT is one of those lines that manages to buck that trend a little bit. But I do think Playmates is a company that doesn't feel that it can really compete with the big boys in the traditional toys, and sees an opportunity here in these video game things, which are heating up more and more.
Well, especially because the video game rights to TMNT, which have been minting gold, are sitting at Konami, and they're not getting a chunk of that.
No, they didn't get to luck into things like Kenner Parker did when nobody understood video game rights, so they just kind of declared they had the video game rights to Star Wars because they had the action figure rights, and that just kind of worked out. Companies are a little more savvy about that kind of thing by the 1990s.
Exactly. And this move to toys is, like you said, no toy gets a third Christmas, so...
Yes, we also have a report, funny enough, that Playmates revenue drops.
Yes. This coming just a day, shortly after this announcement of going into video games. So Playmates toys saw their 1992 revenue drop by 10.43%, due in large part to the recession in Europe, but also saturation of demand for their largest property, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which in 1991 accounted for 80% of their revenue, but now only accounts for 60% of their revenue. They have decided to diversify with the introduction of 12 new toy lines, including Skeleton Warriors and video games.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, we know what's coming. A little character named Jim, who may or may not be an earthworm.
Mm-hmm.
And Playmates will try to replicate the Ninja Turtles model with cartoons and video games and action figures and cartoons and blah, 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 blah. I mentioned cartoons already. Okay, yeah.
Did we mention there's a cartoon? Kids love cartoons. Yeah, we'll see how all that works out in later jumps. I'm sure it'll be great. And finally, a bit of licensing news in the video game front as EA signs Shaq and Jordan.
Electronic Arts showed off not one, but 2 games using Basketball Superstar licenses that were not basketball games at CES. According to Electronic Games Magazine, Shaq's game didn't impress, but Michael Jordan's looked great. And here...
it's about right. For what it is, Michael Jordan in the Windy City is not bad. And for what it is, Shaq Fu definitely is very bad.
Very, very true. Now, I have not played the Windy City game, so I will take your word for it. I
wouldn't rush out and get a copy, but it's all things considered, it's better than it has any right to be.
Gotcha. And I thought it was just kind of weird that EA, which, one of its first big successes was one-on-one, didn't try to do a new update to one-on-one at this point. They just released the NES port, or sub-licensed the NES port like 2 years earlier with Jordan versus Bird. And it just felt like this could have been an interesting one-on-one matchup because the two play styles of these players were so different. But oh well.
I don't know for certain because even though I've talked to some EA Sports people, I hadn't necessarily talked about this in particular. But I think it's probably as much as anything that they had consciously taken things in the direction of full team basketball, like. After Jordan v. Bird, that's what they saw as kind of the next big evolution, was actually getting two full teams on the court at once. And while they were busy doing that, NBA Jam kind of cornered that other market. It's 2-on-2, not 1-on-1, but still, it's hard to figure trying to put a 1-on-1 basketball game up against the juggernaut that is NBA Jam.
You mean Jordan in flight wasn't going to cut the mustard?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It's a little speculation and armchair quarterbacking, but I have to imagine that probably played into it. But that does bring us in to the end of our video games, but there's plenty more to go as we switch over to computers and the continuing woes of a once beloved brand as Commodore Australia closes down.
Commodore Business Machines, the Australian company that has been distributing Commodore products in Australia since the early 80s, is no more. Whether the recently created Commodore Asia Pacific will take over supplying the territory is unknown.
I find it rather unlikely, though, considering our next headline. It just makes sense to put them together. Commodore warns of imminent bankruptcy.
Without financial help, Commodore International Limited warned that they would be forced into reorganization or liquidation. Reporting its third quarterly loss since June 30th, 1993, the company's revenues for the quarter ending December 31st have shrunk from $237.7 million in 1992 to just $70.1 million in 1993. Losses for the most recent quarter were $8.2 million, down from the $77.2 million a year earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, we talked about this a few months back, that there was a meeting of the board of directors in the Bahamas, and I don't know for certain, but it's pretty clear that at that point, the decision was made that unless Commodore can continue to make money, they're not going to postpone liquidating, because Gould, the head of the company, really has only seen Commodore as a way to finance his lavish lifestyle. If it's not producing the money, he's going to cut and run.
Pretty much.
So we talked already about how the Commodore appearance at CES was basically just a room on the side. One of the Amiga magazines actually has a photo of it. It's kind of a pathetic little room with, they tried to sell it as standing room only. It's, because there's really...
because they couldn't afford the chairs.
And you can tell, it's like the Commodore UK management team, David Pleasance and stuff, are in the back standing there listening to this. It's a ghost town at this point.
They didn't even have a ball pit.
Exactly. Amiga Computing Magazine out of the UK reports that recent visitors to Commodore's Westchester offices describe it as a ghost town. The entire software development crew is down to fewer than 10 people. True ad campaign for the CD32 is not planned due to budget constraints, and they claim to have sold 100,000 units with hopes of selling 300,000 to 500,000 in the US in 1994, which without, they're basically like, well, it'll be word of mouth, right?
Yeah, right. That always sells lots of units. Yeah, I think we're going to have a few more Commodore headlines in this vein coming up in the near future on the program.
Well, and this is an interesting bit here, and I don't know if at the time, because I moved from Germany to the U.S. in the summer of '94. So I'm going to be showing up in Seattle, summer of '94. There's a little shop that specializes in Amiga stuff right downtown in Seattle, across from the pier. And for quite a while, I'm going to be going there every week because I got no place else to go. And picking up UK magazines and stuff. And one of the rumors that goes around that time, and this is after Commodore has announced their bankruptcy and liquidation, is that the reason the CD32 doesn't get a wide release in the US is because of a patent infringement on the CD drive. That's the rumor that's going around in the Amiga community in the US. I haven't seen any sign of that yet. I haven't seen any sign of that anywhere else. It's probably not true. It was probably just something everybody was telling themselves to try to justify why everything was going to hell in a handbasket. But I just thought I'd put that in there because I think I've mentioned it once or twice on the show over the years. And now that we're getting to this point of the story, it's quite clear. They are selling in the US. Very, very limited quantities of the machine. It's just there's no point. There's no ad campaign. It's not visible. It's all imported software. The few ads that exist for it are not great. And we did get the first issue of an Amiga Games magazine in the US. Only 3 issues ever come out. That is, destined to fail. But there is this grassroots movement in the US to try to keep the Amiga alive.
Absolutely.
We know where that's going. So.
Yes, but Commodore is no longer the future. But you know what is the future, or so they keep telling us every few years? VR! And that's why VFX1 brings VR home.
Joystick maker Gravis showed off Forte Technologies' VFX1 VR headset at CES. The $1,000 device promises to bring VR to the home environment with dual adjustable 428 by 244 resolution screens and a comfortable setup that sits atop the user's head and not, like some other devices, placing weight on the bridge of the nose.
VR is always just 5 years away, Carl. Always has been, always will be.
Always will be. Yeah. I mean, this thing is an extremely expensive nicety, I guess. It's, there's really very little point to it.
And, 428 by 244.
Which, I mean, granted, at the time, most games are not running at 640 by 480 yet. So, I mean, in its defense, I mean, you've got a couple of games like Seventh Guest running at 640 by 480, but almost everything else is running at 320 by 240. So this seems like it's sort of halfway to the future. But there's a thing called Doom. And
I think I've heard of that one.
Look up and down in that, and so what's the point of the VR helmet again?
Yeah, to give yourself a headache, I guess. But moving on to some M&A news: New World Computing bought by NTN.
NTN Communications Incorporated, makers of the popular NTN Trivia Bar Games network, has purchased New World Computing, the makers of Might and Magic. NTN bought the games company outright for $10 million in common stock. So, yes, here what we're seeing is, traditional PC game maker has been hitting some rough times, and guess what? There's money to be made in these weird little trivia games, and what's bandied around in the articles is the potential of network gaming.
Exactly.
Could we see network games? Might and Magic Networked is not really considered, but New World Computing has just recently released Spaceward Ho, strategy game that has a network option. There's another game that they've released recently at this point that also has a network option. I can't remember the title now, but that is sort of the speculation is that that's the reason NTN is getting into this, thinking there's something to be exploited there.
And I think it's got to be, because I mean these are the two things that are going on right now, is that the computer game industry is consolidating. It's really too small a pond for all the fish that are in it, especially as more and more mainstream retail outlets start stocking computer games, which A, want to deal with 2 or 3 big players, don't want to deal with a dozen players, but also B, have only very limited shelf space to allocate amongst all of the companies as well. So you have that beginning to happen on the one side, and then you have these outside companies that are hearing about this internet future and this networking future and this multimedia future that are like, maybe we should get in on some of that. And so this is those two trends colliding in one kind of poster child story.
Yeah, and we already covered this a couple months ago because with NTN licensing their trivia games for this Sierra network.
Mm-hmm.
So those games have been coming over. So they already have they already have the infrastructure for online play because all the trivia stuff has to be coordinated between bars all over the world. But now they're already getting into the PC side of things. They've got a taste for it. They probably, and New World Computing, it just makes sense. If you have turn-based strategy, that's something that they can work with. Now, they're not going to hold on to the company for very long. It's going to get sold to 3DO in relatively short order, but still.
Yep. Absolutely, but they're not the only outsiders looking for a way in, as MCA announces game studio.
That's right. Universal Interactive will be MCA's dedicated game publisher. Sid Sheinberg, CEO of MCA, said that it was time for a dedicated studio, so, quote, that MCA will participate fully in the various types of interactive product markets that will develop, end quote.
Yeah, I'm actually a little shocked that they weren't forced to do this a long time ago, because since 1990 they've been owned by a little company called Matsushita.
This is true. Now, Universal Interactive is going to be a very important player, not on the 3DO,
yes,
but of course on the PlayStation.
Yes, and well, you know, I mean, they're the one Sillywood kind of company that really does it right. I mean, they end up in the long run losing out because it turns out that they become just a middleman, and all of the successful developers they nurture just bypass them and go straight to Sony. But I mean, in the beginning, they're very successful and they do it right, and that's because their secret weapon is the number 3 man at the company, which is Skip Paul, who had been at Atari. So they had somebody, you know, taking charge of setting all of this up that actually knew a little thing about video games, which the other Hollywood companies that were trying to get involved in this did not.
Yeah, and they also don't seem to be trying to leverage the film studios.
No. That's not what they want to do. No, they come up with a very pretty unique approach from everyone else at the time. They, instead of wanting to replicate the product of movies, they wanted to replicate the system in which movies were made. By which I mean they wanted to establish a studio system where they made deals with talented individuals and then gave them essentially space on the lot. They had a deal with Steven Spielberg. Amblin Entertainment, was on the lot of Universal, which is, owned by MCA. And so they benefited from being able to distribute all of Steven Spielberg's movies, but they didn't need to own Steven Spielberg or own his movies in order to benefit from that relationship. And they basically were like, well, what if we took our Steven Spielberg approach and applied that to video games? And it worked great for a while until the developers realized that, Sony could also do this thing for them. And then there's only one company taking a cut of their profits, not two. But, it is a very different approach than the other Sillywood companies take. And for a brief period of time, it is very successful. And Skip Paul had a lot to do with that. He didn't run Universal Interactive, but he was the number 3 guy in all of MCA Universal. And he drove a lot of that philosophy in the video game company.
Makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of spreading a wide net for talent in the industry, Broderbund signs up affiliates.
360 Pacific, publishers of Harpoon, Vicarious Entertainment, makers of CNN Time Capsule 1993, and Cyan Incorporated, makers of The Manhole and Mist, have signed on as affiliates to Broderbund, massively expanding its library of entertainment titles and placing a clear focus on multimedia going forward.
Yeah, I mean, Broderbund really bet big on CD-ROM in every way during this time period. In games, in edutainment, children's software, and even productivity software, continuing versions of the print shop and whatnot. I mean, that is really where they're trying to make their mark. But, they're Cyan sort of aside, those aren't exactly the most impressive companies in the business at the time to be signing to affiliate label deals. We're starting to see that Broderbund is, despite their success in the past, is really taking the scraps from the buffet table and not growing the business to the extent that it needs to be viable in this new hyper-competitive market.
Oh, definitely. I mean, they're not understanding which way the wind is blowing. They've let too much of their key talent, the Jordan Mechners and the Will Wrights of this world, simply slip through their fingers.
Well, I mean, Mechner's going to come back to disastrous effect in just a couple of years.
Yeah, okay, that's true.
But yeah, the Will Wrights of the world. Yeah, and I've interviewed Doug Carlston and asked him about their affiliated label program, and he said, yeah, they saw it as a way to size up potential future acquisitions as much as anything. This is when they started it back in the 80s, and he said that the program never really worked out very well for them. So yeah, they need. We've talked about this in past episodes and with some of the other interviews. And the affiliate label programs, it helped them have a larger library so they'd have a little bit more leverage with the retailers, I guess. That's what you needed it for, was for the shelf space. Absolutely.
Yeah. But ultimately, you also need to have product that people want. And by placing the bets on this multimedia stuff, especially in the day and age of Doom, where, content is king and just quantity is not going to do the trick anymore.
Yeah.
It's going to set them back quite a ways.
And some of it only becomes clear in hindsight. I mean, it must have seemed like an absolutely incredible opportunity to sign up Cyan, who just had this huge success with Myst, because then they'll do a sequel and everyone will be rolling in the money. So by this time next year, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, things will be great. Not realizing that Cyan was going to get perfectionist and Riven wouldn't come out until like 1997.
Exactly. Well, and And just the price tag on these things. Mm-hmm. And I also don't have the feeling that the Carlsons are going to want to get involved with the whole super violent or over-the-top characterizations that are going to become so important in the action space.
No, absolutely. That's very true. And then moving on to kind of the other side of the Sillywood equation here, Rocket Science goes full Sillywood.
A new player in the interactive entertainment field has burst onto the scene, Rocket Science Games, sporting a cadre of Hollywood FX artists including Michael Bax, Ron Cobb, Richard Cohen, and Mark Sullivan, and veteran game designers Brian Moriarty and David Fox, with talent from Apple's QuickTime team and some experienced executives, and you should have a recipe for hit gaming content in the CD-ROM age. The company has announced a series of titles including Lodestar, a sci-fi trucking game, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs based on an indie comic, and Dark Ride, a Rube Goldberg-style physics game for the Sega CD. They did hand out an interesting chart that was printed in Computer Gaming World about how they see interactivity and passivity scaling, with the most interactive games being on floppy disks and having the lowest budgets, and them wanting to be a nexus between interactive and non-interactive, something later game reviewers would probably not disagree with when reviewing their games.
Oh, if there is a company that is the poster child for all the folly of Sillywood.
Yep.
It is Rocket Science.
Oh, yes. I actually have a pin that I got when I was working at Electronics Boutique the Christmas of 1995. And it's just this black pin that says, "Why, yes, I am a rocket scientist," which was a promotional item from them. Yeah.
Nice.
Yes. So, yeah, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, that is not a good game. And Lodestar is, yeah, that's going to be worthy of a 7 Minutes in Heaven when it finally drops. If you've not played it before.
No, I have not played anything from the good folks at Rocket Science, so...
That's going to be more like
it's a date, Carl.
Minutes.
You sure know how to show a gal a good time.
All I have to say is, if you watch the FMVs, you're like, who the hell is this supposed to be appealing to? It's a train wreck.
Oh my gosh. But it is not only Hollywood people that are getting more and more into games, it's people in other parts of the traditional software industry as well, as Microsoft's got game.
Microsoft is beefing up its game division after announcing that the latest release of Microsoft Flight Simulator has outsold all previous iterations combined. 12 additional titles, including another entertainment pack and a space simulator by Bruce Artwick, are due out before the end of the year, and Larry Holland is working on a flight sim product due out at some point in the future.
Yep, Microsoft is realizing there's gold in their hills. And again, they're still not thinking to a future where they're in this crazy console business. But, they're at least seeing that they've been a big supporter of CD-ROM for a long time. And they're seeing that games is another area where they can, push into that and have some success. And it's not a big part of the company, but it is a growing part of the company.
Yeah. And also we have to remember, at this point, they're still working on what will become Windows 95. Mm-hmm. And the idea of how that new operating system is going to deal with graphics, and that you're going to be able to launch your games inside of Windows 95 without having to go through a DOS shell, is going to be part of this experiment. Get them playing the games and they'll adopt the new operating system.
Indeed. And maybe that's what the good folks at Apple were thinking about with their less than successful product as the Newton gets games.
Apple has established a new subsidiary, the StarCore Group, which will develop entertainment software for the Newton. Titles include a crossword puzzle program, a gold score tracker, and whodunit mystery game. Quake in your boots, Game Boy.
Oh, Newton.
Oh, and sorry, that wasn't a gold score. It's a golf score tracker.
That makes a lot more sense.
Yes.
Oh, Newton.
Yeah, the Newton is, that's just not going anywhere. But Apple also announced up to 40 CD-ROM titles for both Mac and PC that will include many interactive explorations of real-world sites.
That was one. I remember that being one of those big multimedia pushes. I remember there was a San Diego Zoo program, not an Apple thing, but just there was a San Diego Zoo program that a lot of people I knew had, because it was OEM bundled with CD-ROMs. There was this idea that now we can put all this film on, people would love to just take virtual tours of everything. And, well, no, not really.
No.
Not at that resolution. Maybe if you can get some realistic virtual reality going. So maybe 5 years from now, we get that virtual reality coming together.
I knew you were setting up the comeback to the 5 years, saying that was beautiful. That was beautiful, my friend.
Indeed. But yeah, no, everyone is feeling the pressure to ramp up their technology, ramp up their 3D, virtual reality, immersive experience stuff. Even people in the traditional computer game industry, as Sierra goes big on CGI.
Sierra has invested $400,000 on new equipment to be able to create 3D rendered environments for upcoming titles such as Phantasmagoria.
Yep.
And obviously this idea of the pre-rendered world is, I mean, it seems like that's the future, right? Because Seventh Guest did it, so everybody else has got to follow suit.
Yep, and as you know, since you watched the Dragon Con presentation, Roberta Williams came up to their booth at CES and was like, "You see, you said we couldn't do it, but they're doing it." And so, yeah, it's no surprise that they're ramping up in this area, after the success of the Seventh Guest.
Yeah. And it's, well, we know how this is going to turn out. But
And speaking of Sierra, we now turn our attention to a little spin-off from the company as Tsunami wants to inject you into a game.
Adventure game studio Tsunami has introduced the video injection feature into its Blue Force point-and-click adventure game, designed by Police Quest originator Jim Walls. Players can videotape themselves and send the tape and $29.95 to Tsunami, and they will send back a 3.5-inch floppy disk that adds the player in question as a character in a scene in City Hall.
So, since the game is Blue Force, does this mean that just like Tobias Funke, they all blew themselves?
Yeah.
Oh,
no.
Yes.
No, I'm not even.
No.
No. Apparently, and I read up a little bit on this. There's this whole subplot of this one character who's a clerk in the city hall, which is the character that you can become. So this was designed into the game as they can replace this character with
It's like a cameo appearance, essentially.
A cameo.
Yeah,
but, the character actually has some stuff to do, and, there's some interaction and so forth. And this was something that apparently they wanted to do in multiple adventure games, but as far as I can tell, it only makes it into this one. It may have made it into another Tsunami one, but I couldn't be bothered to look that deep into it.
Sure.
Because it's Tsunami. But it's interesting, what they're seeing as an option at this point. I'd love to know how many people actually did this.
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe Lane Noonan knows the answer. Researches all those people.
Oh, that's true. That's true. She would know.
They.
If anybody did.
They.
Yes. They would know, if anybody knew.
Indeed. Now, meanwhile, in a story that feels more in its place in 1983 than, or 1984 than 1994, Dragon's Lair comes to CD-ROM.
ReadySoft is advertising a myriad of Dragon's Lair CD-ROM-based ports, including Sega CD, 3DO, Real Magic, DOS, and Mac versions.
I mean, I get why this is happening now, because we have affordable CD drives, and this is the first time that you can really, in any reasonable way, bring the original kind of Dragon's Lair experience home. But still, a little bit long in the tooth, but it's the thing. Everyone is trying to get into this multimedia thing. Everyone is trying to get into this next generation thing. And it's like, oh, yeah, Dragon's Lair. We can put that on a CD-ROM now. Sure.
And that was what I thought was interesting with these ads, because they're literally all over the U.S. magazines this month. Haven't seen a review for the product yet, but the fact that they're all out there and it's all the formats. It's like, we're just, you got a CD-ROM drive, we're going to give you Dragon's Lair. Mm-hmm. Which, to this day, continues to be, you got a new device, you got a cell phone, we will give you Dragon's Lair.
I mean, Don Bluth doesn't own the rights to most of his stuff, but he owns the rights to that. Man's got to get paid.
Exactly.
But meanwhile, moving away from all of this advanced CGI, fancy, expensive, pre-rendered nonsense to the emerging indie scene of the computer game industry, shareware confusion rises.
The shareware model seems to be causing a bit of confusion in Germany this month, spurred on by a sudden clamor for Doom. PC Player magazine has a clarification explaining to readers that they can get the shareware version for free or buy it from a shareware distributors for just a few marks to cover copying fees, while the full version is the one you have to order from a licensed distributor in Germany, such as CDV, which is running full-page ads featuring the game this month. German magazine ASM reports about a shareware-related scam concerning a group calling themselves Schutzgemeinschaft Software, or roughly translated Protection Society Software, which has been sending cease and desist letters to a variety of institutions, including a variety of private schools, demanding they cease and use the use of shareware and pay compensation payments of between 1,200 and 2,000 marks, and licensing fees for future use of up to 30,000 marks. Apparently, the organization, based on in a tiny town in Lower Saxony called Bleckede, which I had never heard of and had to look up, has convinced some shareware authors to allow them to be represented by the organization, attempting to legitimize the scam. The police are now investigating the matter.
Niedersachsen's former East Germany, right?
No, Niedersachsen is northern West Germany.
Okay. Oh
yeah, no. This is West Germany. Trust me, if it had been in former East Germany at this point, a lot of people would have been far more skeptical.
That makes sense. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Obviously, I know almost nothing about the German industry, so hadn't heard of this before. But truly, a very interesting story.
Oh yeah, and this is a very small window here, because Doom is going to get put on that index very, very quickly here. So very, very soon, you won't see ads for it anymore. We've talked about the index before. This is this German system back in the day of saying these materials are so destructive to the youth that you can sell them, you just can't advertise them, and you can't put them on a store shelf. You have to ask for them, and they can only be sold under the counter, so to speak. Now, the idea here with the shareware, though, is an interesting one, because it's not just in Germany where shareware, or the question of how much can I charge for shareware? How do we distribute shareware in a pre-internet age, or at least an age before most people have access to the internet? There's a lot of companies selling the shareware versions of programs at relatively high copying costs, if you will. You see this in a lot of ads in the UK and every place else. There's a real business of the sale of public domain software, shareware now becoming also more popular. Should also mention March 14th, 1994 sees the release of the first version of Linux.
Yeah.
So again, this idea of, well, we got this software for free, we're running a bunch of stuff off of it. Do we have to pay? Do we not have to pay? What's the paid version? What's not the paid version? It is a little bit confusing at this point for people used to, get it off the shelf and wait, now we can just download it.
Oh, yeah.
Does it cost anything?
Absolutely. No, I remember the shareware ghetto aisle in Best Buy, which is where I bought all my computer games back in the day. The very first aisle of the computer games, because they want you to see it first, was just the aisle where they had all of these floppies. There were all of the most recent shareware things, and they were, paying you for, you were paying for the privilege of not having to download it, off the internet, basically, because a lot of it was, the internet was still new. Not everyone was necessarily dialed in, har. But, and, of course, I never paid attention to the shareware ghetto. I just skipped right over that aisle. But, yeah, it's a big thing that's about to take over, retail as well, not just, mail order or phone order or internet order or whatever. Speaking of shareware on the internet or online, company networks get doomed.
Intel and other large companies have had to ban Doom from their Office networks as the network code for the game uses high-level broadcast packets, which every computer on the network, regardless of it running Doom or not, must analyze before discarding them. This apparently can bring an entire network to a crawl and slow down the individual machines as well, especially when a lot of people are playing all at once. Jay Wilbur, CEO of id Software, has said that a version 1.2 will solve this problem and communicate between machines involved in a game and add modem play.
Just one of those things no one ever had to think about before, because there was never a game like this being played over the internet, or over a network, because this isn't over the internet, but over a network before.
At least not in these numbers.
Yeah, at least not in these numbers. Yeah, I mean, obviously, computer, even time-sharing systems back in the day had to be constantly vigilant to kick off game players that were taking up much-needed resources. But, yeah, this is a whole order of magnitude different even than that.
Yeah. I mean, they're talking here about how, as soon as lunchtime hits, everybody in the company is just jumping on board and playing. And especially a company like Intel, where you can imagine that, these are geeks. And the thing they're going to want to do is play some Doom in their lunch hour.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So 1.2 is going to solve it, but the interesting part is it's also going to add modem play.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be a network anymore. Now you can do it from home.
Exactly. And, a lot of companies are thinking that maybe this internet thing is something that they need to tap into for their products, as no less than Microsoft announces the Microsoft Network.
Bill Gates announced a joint venture with Telecommunications, the largest TV operator in the U.S., to launch a, quote, new cable network, end quote, that will review new types of software, video games, and financial software and be available within 18 months, according to the Financial Times. Microsoft won't be producing any of the programming for the network, but will be providing software for it. The two also plan on exploring interactive television technologies. Mr. Gates said, quote, we want to create an easy-to-use interface on a lot of applications. Next year's pilot will see if this worthwhile aggressively building the rest of a high-speed optic fiber network. We're betting on the market and investing over $100 million a year. End quote.
The dot-com bubble is starting.
Yeah. Well, and this is the weird thing. If you thought that what I just read was a little confusing, are they talking about a television network? Are they talking about a computer thing? The article is just that messed up and confusing. It makes no sense. They clearly, whoever wrote it for the Financial Times clearly did not understand what was being presented, or the people presenting didn't know what was being presented. What do they mean by an interface? Is it going to be a set-top box-based thing? Nobody knows, but Bill Gates knows. He wants in on it. He wants to be there. He wants to create the interface. And we will have a Microsoft network.
Indeed, but their competitors are not sitting still as IBM and Videotron team up.
IBM and Canadian cable company Videotron have announced a partnership to bring PowerPC processors to set-top boxes. The first phase of the project, estimated at $553 million, calls for installing 34,000 set-top boxes to provide banking, energy management, electronic mail, classified ads, lottery results, and government services. The initiative Universality Bidirectionality Interactivity, or UBI for short, is a combination of Videotron, its VideoWay Communications subsidiary, which has already been offering a set-top box-based interactive TV system with games since 1990, the Hearst Corporation, the National Bank of Canada, Hydro-Quebec, Lotto-Quebec, and the Canada Post Corporation. Yeah, so a couple of things here. The PowerPC processor in question is going to end up being the 403-based PowerPC processor, which is a totally spec-down garbage version of the chip. So it's not going to have a lot of power. The initial test launch for November 1994 will get pushed back several times. IBM is actually going to exit the deal before the launch, and it won't actually go into test until September of 96, and it's just not going to go anywhere because the internet is a burgeoning thing by that point.
Indeed. But yeah.
Oh,
go ahead.
The most interesting bit about this story, though, was this VideoWay Communications subsidiary. I had never heard about it before, but this was an actual thing in Quebec at this point. And their set-top boxes are essentially a souped-up version of the MSX standard. And with the capability of playing games, I included a link to some of the games being played. And it's kind of interesting that in 1990, they're using this setup to provide all sorts of enhanced teletext services because, well, you got enough of a processor to do it. You know, it's an 8-bit processor, but it'll still do the job. So the fact that this thing is running and it's just this weird little, niche product with a lot of French content was extremely interesting. That was
Indeed
my takeaway here.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on then to a bit of retail news. A Japanese recession hits Akihabara.
The spreading Japanese recession is hitting almost all of Japan's industries in equal measure. According to the Tokyo Commerce and Industry Research Center, a credit survey organization, of the 94,269 firms that reported taxable income of 40 million yen or more between October 1992 and September of 1993, only 2.44% of them reported profit increases for 5 consecutive years. That percentage actually decreases if one adds companies with incomes below 40 million yen. Of the top 5 companies beating the trend, 2 were construction companies, 1 a pharmaceutical company, 4th was Canon, and 5th was Sega Enterprises, which was also one of 6 companies making computer games or pachinko machines in the top 50 companies as measured by this survey. This is seen as a major shift in the economy of Japan as many heavy industries begin to falter and the consumer appetite for electronics wanes, as seen by struggles in Akihabara, the electronics district in Tokyo, where 2 major retailers have already folded and many more small electronics component shops and appliance retailers find it hard to compete for a dwindling market of buyers and increased price competition in the suburbs. Yeah. So we've talked about it in the 40-year jumps, the pressure on the Japanese economy to open up a little bit more, the increasing omnipresence of the bubble economy, and the increasing reliance of America on other Asian countries for manufacturing. That starts in the early 80s, and there's going to be a big story about that in the next 40-year jump, is really starting to take an effect in Japan. The bubble has burst, the economy's going down, and the purchasing power of individuals in Japan is not what it used to be. And so now, Akihabara, which has always been, this retail spot with so many small retailers where the prices, were okay, but small retailers, still just a small retailer, are going to now start hitting problems. And if you look at pictures of the area today, most of those small retailers are long gone. It's more, otaku type of stuff. And it's a very different feel from back then. The New York Times article that gives us a lot of this detail, the photo that they have of this, this older guy sitting behind this booth with hundreds and hundreds of small little items hanging everywhere, just would not fit with the modern picture of that retail space.
Mm-hmm. And in a similar vein, discounting takes Japanese retail by storm.
The Japanese recession and market liberalization laws pushed for by the U.S. have begun to reshape the Japanese retail landscape. Over the last 3 years, since major reforms were enacted in 1990, the traditional stranglehold of Japanese manufacturers on retailers through suggested retail prices, which, if not complied with, would lead to supplies being cut, as well as multiple layers of wholesalers all getting oversized cuts of sales prices, and requirements to get approval from the powerful Ministry of International Trade and Industry for retail spaces with more than 1,000 square meters, has been broken, and large retailers with more purchasing power and the ability to deal directly with manufacturers or carry their own store-branded lines have begun to emerge. This has also meant lower prices for consumers, a welcome thing given the recession racking the economy. One of the first foreign retailers to come in, also something made easier through the 1990 reforms, was Toys R Us, which negotiated directly with Nintendo for goods and brought down prices by bypassing wholesalers. The turnover per store of Toys R Us in Japan is $15 to $20 million a year, double that of American stores.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Again, this is coming, I believe, from the Financial Times in London. So the breakdown on the numbers and everything in this article was very, very interesting. And just the fact that these laws that began 3 or 4 years ago are now having such a massive effect. But the fact that the MIDI, and we've talked about the MIDI a lot in our 40-year jumps, was prohibiting or making it almost impossible to have storefronts or stores with more than 1,000 square meters of store space. Explains a lot about the Japanese retail environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the moment you get rid of that restriction, suddenly you have completely different economies. And what they're describing here, as far as the methodologies, explains a lot about how Nintendo of America in the early salad days of the NES was treating third-party publishers, was treating retailers with NES product, because this is what they knew from Japan. This is how things were done in Japan under these rules. And if they hadn't had the monopoly on the market through the NES, they would have probably never gotten away with it in the US. But they got away with it. They just brought over those mechanisms. The moment that gets broken by Sega, suddenly stuff starts unraveling. Sorry, it gives you a different perspective on why Nintendo acted the way it did.
Oh, absolutely, it does.
How Japan was working up until this point.
Absolutely, I agree with that totally.
Yeah.
Now, moving to the other side of the world, Rhino Group grows.
As the market for video games in the UK gets more complex, the rise of the specialty retailer seems to be dawning. The Rhino Group, which acquired Richard Branson and W.H. Smith's Virgin Game stores in November and runs its own Future Zone stores, reported pre-tax profits of for 1993 of £2 million, up from just £154,000 the previous year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is the dawn of Game, which essentially is the last standing game retail outlet or not last standing game outlet, but last standing chain in the UK today.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's interesting, especially that what I didn't know was that the Virgin Game stores were a joint project of Richard Branson and W.H. Smith's.
Yeah, I didn't know that myself.
Yeah, so it's, we're seeing that evolution from the early 80s where the big elephant in the room of game retail on cassette for the microcomputers was W.H. Smith.
Yep.
And they then transitioned to the Virgin Game stores where the consoles also play a bigger role because Virgin is distributing the Master System. And then is now transitioning into game. So that DNA of those, the magazine shops selling you your games on cassette is still in there. It's kind of cool.
Absolutely. But it's not just the retail space that is seeing a few ups and downs in this time period. The publishing space is also getting complicated. And we have a few headlines to cover there, starting with UK mag publisher Impact calls it quits.
Europress Impact publisher Graham Kidd, a Zap64 and Crash veteran, told Computer Trade Weekly that, given the intense market pressures, in just 1 year the number of PC games mags went from 4 to 10, and Future Publishing has 3 Amiga magazines alone on the newsstands. Quote, "Everyone is waiting to see who will crack first," end quote. Many were expecting a December bump in magazine sales in the UK, but that didn't materialize, with computer and video game related mag sales actually dropping from 1.9 million in December 1992 to just 1.3 million in 1993. This means the end of Impact's 6 magazines, including Sega Force, Amiga Force, and Commodore Force, which was the renamed version of venerable Zap64.
So before we get into the cogent analysis here, I have to ask: racked up another casualty? Was that deliberate?
It was a slow news day, so I had to come up with something.
Yes, but this just goes to show that the early 90s is not the time to put all your eggs in the Commodore basket.
Yeah, it's that, and I think what happened, and this is where that jump from 4 to 10 PC magazines is really showing that the very fractured, I mean, we still have Amstrad Action is still being published every month in the UK, and the magazine is so desperate, they have no idea what to bring anymore. They haven't had a game review in months at this point. They're reviewing a new GUI that was released for the CPC, and they're like, well, it all depends on whether or not there'll be more product. And there's this desperate editorial of this month or last month asking, you guys, readers, please tell us what you want us to bring, because we'd love to find out what you want.
And readers were just like, we're good, bro. We're just going to go over here now.
Yeah. But this is happening in all of the magazines that aren't PC magazines or console magazines at this point. And, it's
the end of an era. I mean, like you said, this fragmentation that's existed in the UK market for so long is suddenly getting unfragmented. And that means there's just not room for all of these magazines, especially on formats that are on their way out without a viable replacement.
Well, and that's the thing. And once you're down to one or two formats, then you don't need all these publishers, because a publisher that's only putting out a couple of magazines isn't going to have the distribution channels for those.
No.
So, but this is the end of Zap 64. We talked about this like 2 years ago when Zap 64 got reformatted and completely changed the way the layout worked and everything else. It really wasn't the same magazine any longer, but still, the end of an era.
Absolutely. But as one door closes, another opens as Dark Horse Comics gets into Games Mag business.
The masters of licensed comics such as Aliens, Predator, and Star Wars has dipped their toes into gaming with a gaming magazine come comic anthology called Max Overload. This UK-based magazine combines game news, reviews, and 2000 AD-like serialized comic stories based on Lemmings, Chuck Rock, Toe Jam and Earl, and Green Dog.
This is what happens when indie comics try to get into your video games, I guess.
Yeah, it's no Reese's peanut butter cup. That's for damn sure. Now, they only released 2 issues of this, and you can already tell from the second issue where the format is going to fail, because those 4 games I mentioned, Lemmings, Chuck Rock, Toe Jam and Earl, and Green Dog, really.
One of these things.
They all get reviewed in the first issue. But because of the format, you have to keep the stories going in future issues, but all the reviews in the next issue have nothing to do with those 4 comics anymore. And so, it wouldn't take very long before the comics have no relationship with the reviews any longer. And games just come and go so quickly. It's very seldom that a game has staying power, and kids are buying the magazines to find out what's new, not to read the stories of some characters that came out ages before.
Yeah, they clearly needed to figure out some kind of Captain N style format for those comics.
Oh, definitely. Oh, that would have been really a saving grace, but then you're dealing with so many licensing issues that, if you're not Nintendo holding everybody's, life in your hand and being able to play God, that's not going to happen.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
But this is a period of great change in the industry, and it's not just in terms of who is and is not putting out magazines, as the technology is also changing. And in that vein, move over cover discs, CDs are here.
Well, not quite yet. So, German magazine Powerplay is offering readers a CD full of demos and patches for just 12 D-Mark. That's about $4. And you can buy it by mail or by bank transfer plus fax. And this is something that if you've listened to my interviews with Michael Hengst, who was at Powerplay at this point, this was one of the big bones of contention and the reason why he gives for leaving the magazine. So cover discs had been a big deal in the European magazine scene for a while. Tapes were still the number one thing on the 8-bits, on 16-bit machines, Atari ST, Commodore, Amiga, and PC. The cover disc was a big thing. Now, Powerplay was a multi-format magazine. There was no single format you could do here. But their major rival publisher had already started to diversify with their with magazines like PC Games and Amiga Games, which each had at least one cover disc each month. And so this idea of moving to CD, because the CD is starting to explode, it feels like it's the idea that's coming. When will PCs have enough, or enough PCs will have CD-ROM drives in order to make this a possibility as a free add-on? That's the big question. But as we've also talked about over the last year, in the United States, Computer Gaming World magazine has been running a monthly segment about the patches, coming out for games and being distributed online where most people don't have access to them. These cover CDs in Europe are going to become the method for distributing patches. It's going to be a major issue every month. You buy the magazine so you have the CD, so you have all the latest patches.
Interesting.
And so this idea is coming. And curiously enough, there's another little side note here. This month's issue of 64, which is the German C64 mag that's still being published at this point, they actually have announced that they will be adding covered discs for the very first time to their magazine, but only for people subscribing so that there's not a lot of wasted plastic, is the argument.
Gotcha.
So yeah, it's this in-between phase. We don't have the internet yet, but there's all these files to distribute, and the medium CD is getting cheaper and is big enough, so why not?
Indeed, and in fact, that is a major factor in our next story as well, as multimedia porn becomes harder to ignore.
The apparent flood of digitized porn that is now arriving on PC seems to be a major topic for magazine publishers this month. Computer Gaming World's editorial largely focuses on how porn and violence are forcing the magazine to decide who their magazine is targeting and how to address these issues, especially as a move to more realistic and less fantastic games in the multimedia age mean that topics may be discussed in legitimate products that may not be appropriate for kids. Acorn User Magazine in the UK is also dealing with this topic, as PC emulation on Archimedes systems is good enough now to unlock much of the digitized porn available on PC, and guidelines for how to regulate this use on school computers, where the Archimedes is mainly used in the UK, especially on school networks, becomes a major topic. Yeah. It really is something that's everywhere. Again, earlier in the year, we talked about how Computer Gaming World had put in a ban on the advertising of porn CDs in the magazine, risque games. I mean, there's been a flood of them coming in, some of them tamer than others, but I mean, the only game people are talking about on CDI at this point is Voyeur, and most of the magazines also had reviews this month or last month of Man Enough. I mean, these are terrible, terrible programs, but at the same time, there is this idea that we can get an older audience with these, especially given the price tag on the equipment necessary to play them.
Indeed.
Yeah. Just as a side note, German magazine PC Player reported that for the first time ever, the pornography producers that had traditionally been showing off their video cassette wares at CES moved to their own show at the Sahara, and that parallel show was chock-a-block with offerings on CD-ROM, including a rock, paper, scissors CD-ROM porn game. They also noted that the video compression quality of many of the films, including quote-unquote classic films, made many CD-ROM games such as Rebel Assault look like first-generation demos.
Yeah, video compression is really coming into its own at this point. And, one video game connection there is, of course, that IDOS began as a company marketing a video compression software, because that is the bold new frontier with this multimedia stuff getting more and more prevalent.
Well, let's face it. I mean, all you had to do was look at CDI to see, if you can't stream that video, nobody cares. Your text encyclopedia on a CD is not going to get anybody excited.
No way. But now we turn our attention at the end of our publishing segment to a little bit of nostalgia here, appropriate for the time machine, as McGraw-Hill publishes Best of Byte.
Celebrating the upcoming 20th anniversary of Byte magazine, publisher McGraw-Hill has brought out The Best of Byte, 2 decades on the leading edge, collecting many of the best articles from 20 years of the publication, including news briefs, hardware reviews, and even fiction by luminaries such as Michael Crichton.
Byte is an interesting one because Byte was always the hardware-focused one. You had David All out there with creative computing, doing his whole thing about how to make people, even ordinary people, comfortable using computers. You had some of the other early ones that were about this or that format or whatnot. But Byte was always about, was always the one for the people that just wanted to get down and dirty with these things.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's technical on a level that is almost bordering on manic at times. And that's great. I mean, you need to have that. And it's fun to read through the reviews of the stuff because the technology that I'm looking at in the magazines is 30 years old or 40 years old. It's old enough that I can understand it with the perspective that we have. But if I had to pick it up at the time, I probably would have been completely lost.
Absolutely. So yeah, as we'll no doubt see as our jumps continue closer to the present, the era for this kind of magazine is just about past with the way the computers are becoming more and more mainstream. But Byte, at least for now, is still holding on and remembering a simpler time when no one knew how to do things with these computers unless they had some guidance from a publication like Byte.
Very true.
All right, as always, we'll wrap up with a few miscellaneous stories, starting with Japan buys more chips abroad.
Following a 1991 trade agreement between the U.S. and Japan, the percentage of imported chips used in Japan has increased to over 20%, the mark set by the agreement. The bulk of the increase has come from chips imported from Asia and Taiwan, and at a new round of negotiations in Hawaii, the U.S. pushed for a greater use of American-made chips in video games, something a representative of the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry called unreasonable, since the U.S. chip suppliers target high-value chips. Sega stated they expected their foreign chip procurement in 1994 to rise to 27% from 16% in 1993 and just 10% in 1992. While Nintendo sees their foreign procurement at 25% in 1994, up from 21.1% in 1993.
Yeah, I mean, this, of course, all stems back to the worldwide RAM shortage at the end of the 1980s. And there was basically a complete gap formed because there had been a time when the U.S. companies were responsible for, like, the leading cutting-edge new fancy chips, and then the Japanese were picking up kind of the last generation. But then suddenly the Japanese got all leapfroggy and jumped right into the current generation and kind of dumped the previous generation as unprofitable, and then worldwide chaos ensued, quite frankly. And so, of course, the U.S. Stepping in here was probably hoping that this would lead to, getting the U.S. chip industry back on its feet a little bit. But instead, it's just the reason why everything comes out of other parts of Asia now. Though, obviously, in more recent times, we've appreciated the Silicon Shield, as it's called, that helps protect Taiwan from Chinese invasion.
Definitely. I mean, the geopolitics of this whole situation is getting thornier. And in our next 40-year jump, we're going to see that. There's a watershed moment that we'll be reporting on in our next episode about this. But yeah, but also this acknowledgement that video games are not using the cutting edge chips. Those high-end chips are not going there. Now, they are going into PCs, but they're not going to go into video game consoles.
Absolutely.
And so, at least not yet.
Yes.
But, okay, enough about what's going on in Japan.
Indeed. Moving back to the United States, we are told that girls need to get into games.
That's right. The Wall Street Journal reports that a growing number of psychologists and educators are beginning to believe that girls are placing themselves at a disadvantage for careers in high-tech industries by not playing video games like their male counterparts.
Yeah, well, maybe if you'd make some games that girls appreciate, I guess. But that's the age-old chicken and egg problem. I mean, there's stories like this every few years. About how, girls aren't into games, and publishers are now targeting girls with games, and why don't girls get into games? And, the cycle repeats itself.
Yeah, and I mean, it also has to do with how the stuff is marketed. Show me a Nintendo or Sega commercial back in the day where it's girl play.
No, absolutely.
It was always, I mean, even a game like Mario where you could easily, without a problem, fit that into the stereotypical girl demographic. And I use the word stereotypical here, conscientious that it would still be a stereotype.
Absolutely.
And it's still, I mean, they saw this as a boy's toy and they just kept pushing it as a boy's toy, and it just never, it took a very long time. I mean, nowadays it's fairly acceptable. I mean, when I talk about video games with my students at university, there's virtually nobody who doesn't play games. I mean, boys and girls equally. And so that tide has finally changed. That tide has finally shifted. But, it's coming 40 years late, and it's going to be a long time before that can trickle down into the high-tech industry writ large.
Oh, absolutely. With just about any solution that has been attempted for getting more girls into STEM. And believe me, it's kind of odd for the Wall Street Journal to be hyping on this, because in 1994, there are way, way more obstacles for getting girls into STEM and into computers than just they're not playing games. But, every time we try to solve this problem, it's politicians that want immediate results. So they're always targeting, like, we got to do more in high school. We got to do more in college, because they want to see people, like, within a couple of years, advancing into these fields. And it's never like, we need to start in kindergarten or preschool, and, like, it's going to take 15 years to see results. But if they started it down there, they would actually see results, instead of just continually cycling through this, middle school, high school, college period when it's already too late.
Well, because, let's face it, a politician only cares about the next election cycle.
Exactly.
And if they spend a lot of money on something that doesn't have results by the next election cycle, they're out. And it is a horribly, horribly defective system.
Absolutely. But at least there are a few role models, in a way, for young girls out there on the television as Carmen Sandiego goes around the world.
The hit U.S. TV show Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, a geography-based game show for kids, has begun to get international franchising. In Germany, the show is being produced by station MDR out of their studios in Chemnitz. So we got a bunch of different international versions of the show, France, Spain, and so forth. Some of them last longer than others. Most of them don't last nearly as long as the US version did. But, it is pretty cool to see that this is a concept that did get some international exposure.
Yeah, absolutely. Meanwhile, not video game related yet, but certainly will be having its own impact on video games in time, Magic the Gathering takes gaming market by storm.
According to game retailers, January was a breakout month for Wizard of the Coast's Magic the Gathering card game. The packs have been flying off the shelves for the game originally released in the previous fall.
Man, I wish I had gotten in on the ground floor of Magic the Gathering, Carl. Oh, my goodness. I mean, I didn't start playing. The first time I ever played was during 3rd edition, but I didn't start collecting the cards on my own until 4th edition. And I have a few cards that have definitely appreciated in value since that time, because I got some dual lands from Revised and other stuff that fetch a pretty penny. But I mean, I was not there at Alpha, Carl. Oh my goodness.
I could have almost been, because I started high school in Seattle in the fall of '94, and the kids were playing, and I had some geeky friends who were like, dude, you gotta try this game out. And when they explained it to me, I was like, oh, okay, but why does he have different cards than you? Well, you buy these packs. And then I was like, oh, so you buy the packs, and if you get lucky, you get the good cards. If you're not lucky, you get the bad cards.
You are the perfect drug.
And I was like,
drug,
yeah,
the perfect drug. That was me too. So, I mean, like I said, I mean, I wouldn't have started at Alpha. I would have only started at Revised or 3rd edition if I had started when my friends started getting into it. But I felt the same way at first. It's like, I don't know that I want to get myself into this sinkhole.
Yeah.
But I did.
Yeah.
I mean, I spent spending money that I had to spend. I mean, I didn't like go in debt to the mob buying Magic cards, but I definitely went deep on Magic for a few years. But yeah, I mean, there was a Lotus just went for like millions recently.
That's insane.
A Black Lotus. It's just absolutely insane. Tell you who I really feel sorry for is, you remember the card Chaos Orb? I don't know.
No, I never followed it. I never got into Magic.
So there was a card called Chaos Orb that became very valuable very quickly because it was banned in tournament play. And then, of course, like all of the early cards that were then taken out of circulation, has just grown ridiculously in power. Chaos Orb was a card that you basically could flip over your opponent's play area, and anything it touched would be instantly destroyed, just gone from the game. Didn't matter what type of card it was. Like anything it touched blew up. And so some enterprising players who weren't thinking about long-term collectability were actually ripping up their Chaos Orbs, presumably in anti-games, presumably not just in a regular game with their friends, but, gambling was actually a very big part of the early Magic the Gathering.
Oh, yeah.
And would actually rip up their cards with the logic that they could do a confetti stream over their players' play area, and everything that those little pieces touched would be destroyed. I believe, though I'm not 100% positive, that Wizards of the Coast eventually issued a errata saying, don't do that. But, I bet those people that ripped up those early Chaos Orbs feel really stupid now. It's like when the people put the baseball cards in the spokes of their bicycles.
Yeah, that would not be a good idea. But it was a lot of fun at the time.
But Magic the Gathering, it took everyone by surprise how big it blew up, which is why the early cards are so rare, that the alpha and the beta sets, but especially the alpha set, are so incredibly rare, because they were just doing these small production runs, and then suddenly everybody needed to have Magic the Gathering cards, and there were not enough to go around, leading to second or third printing, depending on how you want to count it, the Unlimited series, which was just the basic set issued again, but with a white border instead, and to try to just keep feeding that demand. So it blew up so fast, faster than anyone could have imagined.
Yeah,
so.
And like I said, the toy industry is looking at this going, this is something that we can put on the shelves. It's not going to cost as much as those Nintendo cartridges. When we get stuck with it, it's not that big of an investment. And the kids just keep coming in, and it's regular purchases. We don't have to wait 6 months before they come back to buy another one.
Yeah, well, and of course, it just, in the hobbyist stores, too, it just, because, the hobbyist stores, would always host game nights, but it tended to be, an older crowd playing, Warhammer or 40K or, some other strategy kind of game like that. But then suddenly, everyone was flooding into their local hobby shop or gaming store to be part of Magic the Gathering tournaments, and it really had a huge boom impact for a brief period of time, too, on just the local hobby store scene.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Until, of course, you ended up with stores that just sold cards.
Indeed. But moving back into the realm of technology, probably not as impactful on gaming, but certainly as Magic, but certainly more impactful on computers as a whole. Linux launched.
On March 14th, 1994, Linus Torvald released Linux. And nothing changed for games.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, a lot of tech geeks still love their Linux and would run the whole world off of Linux if they could get away with it. But
if they could get the sound drivers to work.
Yeah, right.
I still remember it must have been in 96, 97, there was a PvP comic where I can't remember the character's name. He was the Quake kid. Did you ever read PvP?
An issue here or there, but not enough to be able to know who the characters were after all this time.
Yeah, so the one kid, he's the teenage FPS reviewer for the magazine. Back when PvP was about a magazine, not a website. And he somehow falls into this rabbit hole of Linux is great, and he's going to this Linux conference, and he wants nothing more than to get all the performance out of his machine to play Quake, with the Linux. And he's waiting in line, and he's hearing these guys like, yeah, I got, 120 frames a second in Age of Empire. Now, I still don't have the sound working, and these other features don't work, but, it's running 120. And he's just sort of under his breath says, well, if I didn't have the sound working and all the effects working, yeah, I would run at 120 on my Windows machine too. And then everybody turns on him. And that was the end of the Linux thing. It's like,
good times.
Yeah.
Yes, me not being a particularly technical person, I never got into Linux, but certainly my co-host at They Create Worlds, Jeffrey, and many of my other friends had their Linux partitions on all their machines back in the day.
Well, you got to have a hobby, and yeah.
Indeed. And we'll end today on a bit of a somber note as we all hitch up our wagons, head east, and bid a fond farewell to one John Candy.
Yeah, this is not video game related, but I happened to run across this while I was doing the research this month, and John Candy's passing was, well, he was one of my favorite comedic actors of the era. I first encountered him in Splash, went to see that with my dad and his best friend when I was a kid. And just always followed him. Every time I saw him in a movie, I just had to watch that movie. And I remember hearing that he had passed, and it was a real bummer.
Yeah. No, I have fond memories. I forget. Did you ever watch SCTV?
No, that didn't air in Seattle back in the day. So
that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I only saw SCTV as an adult. I didn't see it, as a kid, but. Certainly, it was fantastic on SCTV, and I mean, I loved Uncle Buck. I loved Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. Is one of my favorite comedies. Of course, his nearly entirely improv cameo in Home Alone is such a treat. Always loved John Candy myself as well.
And come on.
Yeah, oh, well, of course, obviously. And there was a Saturday morning cartoon, but we don't talk about that because Saturday morning cartoons are generally awful. Like, you remember all the awesome cartoons from your childhood? Yeah, those were all weekday syndicated cartoons. They were not the Saturday morning cartoons.
You mean Camp Candy was not a timeless classic?
No, not quite. I knew you'd know what I was talking about, Carl.
Of course.
I knew.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, I watched Saturday morning cartoons in that time period, so I mean, I watched Camp Candy, but I mean, it was not appointment viewing.
All I can say is I've never actually seen an episode. I just remember it was advertised in those, new Saturday morning lineup double page ads that would run in comic books.
Right, because this was 1989 or so. So it was when you would have aged out of Saturday morning cartoons, but I was still prime demographic for Saturday morning cartoons.
Oh, I would still tune in just for the Bugs Bunny repackage, whatever it was. I think ABC always had that. It was ABC or CBS, but yeah, I'd still tune in for that occasionally. But yeah, I mean, Saturday morning had left me behind as soon as Batman the Animated Series hit. You didn't need Saturday morning anymore.
No, just more Batman.
There you go. Okay, that is the end of the episode. We have covered a lot of stories today. So, Alex, your final duty as the co-host. What is the word of the episode?
Well, I think that there is one word or phrase, as I actually often do it, that has to be used to perfectly encapsulate the confusion that we are seeing right now. And that word or phrase is next generation? Question mark at the end of it. The question mark's part of it. Because we kind of have the first wave of next generation like bouncing off hard. We have the second wave of the next generation leaving a lot of people skeptical, and we have a lot of companies kind of caught in the fallout. So whether it's all our 3DO stories were reported on, Commodore's continuing woes and failure to save itself with the CD32, Sega going dual with both the 32X and the Saturn, it's just like, next generation?
Very, very true. And at the same time, it's like, do we really need new hardware? Look at Doom.
Exactly. So, yeah, I think that's where we're going to go this time around.
Works for me. So, remind all the fine folks at home where they can find your fine work.
Absolutely. As always, They Create Worlds is the brand, which is primarily the podcast. TheyCreateWorlds.com is the overarching website. The podcast can be found at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, and we have recently started adding all of the episodes to our YouTube channel as well. Now, I want to be clear that these are not video versions of the podcast. You're not going to see Jeffrey's and I's talking heads because we don't really need that. But Jeff did put together a cute little visualizer for it, so it's not just bare bones default. This is YouTube doing audio either. So if for some reason YouTube is your favored way to engage with these kinds of podcasts, the channel is They Create Worlds Podcast, at They Create Worlds Podcast. And I don't think they're quite all up there yet, but all the new episodes are going to be posted there going forward, and we're frantically filling in the back catalog. Basically, Jeff and another good friend of ours are both attacking it, and I forget which is which, but one of them started at episode 1 and is moving forward. The other one started at the end and is moving backwards, and eventually they are going to meet here in the middle.
And you will be creating a playlist for people to be able to organize that if they want to listen to it, right?
I mean, that would be the logical thing to do, Carl, but
I'm just saying it's very easy to do on YouTube, and it's probably a good idea. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Yes, I believe we will be there. There are a few basic playlists now separating our podcast episodes from our other video content, of which there's a little, but not a huge amounts. But I can certainly see us creating some thematic playlists along the way to further make some of that back catalog accessible for sure.
Very good. And remember, visualizer or not, you can also listen to this wonderful show on YouTube. But instead of a visualizer, you'll get the beautiful episode artwork. Which, if you didn't know there was episode artwork, well, go to YouTube and find out that there's episode artwork.
Indeed.
Okay, with that being said, everybody remember links are in the show notes, and if I do manage to get this cut in time on the 31st of May, we will again be having our patron hangout. So come and join us there and get some more fun trivia and all the other good stuff. And yeah, with that being said, have fun.